This story is about a grandfather named Chris Watson who lived a comfortable life. Chris spent decades building his career, starting out in social work, helping the homeless, before transitioning into the lucrative travel and tourism industry. He divided his time between his quiet hometown and Saigon, Vietnam, where he had established a successful network of travel companies. Chris was a man of routines, but he also had a taste for the finer things. He drove a beautiful high-end Ford Raptor truck, and he was almost always carrying his signature Louis Vuitton bag. To his family, Chris was a doting grandfather who wanted to ensure his children and grandchildren were set up for the future. Through smart investments, Chris had managed to amass a fortune of around $3 million. He felt like he could finally sit back and enjoy his retirement. But unfortunately, his success also drew the attention of someone with a dark, greedy plan. It all began on what was supposed to be a peaceful vacation. Chris had been working hard and felt like he needed a break. Before leaving, he made sure to get a routine checkup at his dentist's office, and he had even taken care of his health by getting vaccinated with Gardasil, as he wanted to ensure he was in peak physical shape. He was an active, older man who loved outdoor activities, especially cycling with local clubs. As he boarded his flight and began his holiday, Chris decided to completely unplug. He turned down his screen brightness, put his phone on silent, and prepared to enjoy some quiet time away from work. But shortly after arriving at his vacation spot, his dream holiday quickly turned into a living nightmare. It started very subtly. Chris was relaxing in his rental home when he began to feel a slight discomfort in his stomach. At first, he brushed it off as a simple case of food poisoning or jet lag from his travels. He decided to drink some water and try to sleep it off. But as the hours went by, his condition grew dramatically worse. He was hit with violent waves of nausea and started vomiting uncontrollably. Along with the stomach pain, a blinding, crushing headache began to set in. But the most terrifying symptom was the sudden failure of his vision. Chris realized he could barely see. The room was spinning and everything looked incredibly dark and blurry, even when he turned the lights up. His family, realizing this was far more serious than a simple stomach bug, rushed him to the nearest hospital. When Chris arrived at the emergency room, the medical staff was completely baffled. His organs were rapidly shutting down, and his blood chemistry was severely abnormal. The doctors tried everything they could to stabilize him. Because Chris had recently visited his dentist and taken some routine medications, the doctors initially wondered if he was experiencing an extremely rare, delayed allergic reaction to an anesthetic. They ran standard toxicology screens and treated him for severe metabolic distress, but nothing they did seemed to work. Within a matter of hours, Chris Watson passed away. The sudden, agonizing death of this vibrant, healthy grandfather left his family in an absolute state of shock and grief. They could not understand how a man who had been in such great shape just days before could suddenly deteriorate and die so quickly. In the immediate aftermath, the local authorities and medical staff believed that Chris's death was the result of a tragic accident or a natural medical emergency. The initial theory was that he had suffered a stroke or accidental food poisoning. It seemed like a tragic, heartbreaking end to a wonderful life, and the police were prepared to close the case as a death by natural causes. But then, a massive financial red flag went up that changed the entire direction of the case. Only a few days after Chris passed away, a claim was filed to access his estate and his $3 million life insurance policy. The family expected that Chris's hard-earned wealth would be distributed to his children and grandchildren, but they were stunned to find that the primary beneficiary on his accounts had been changed very recently, right before his death. The person claiming the $3 million was not his children or his grandchildren. It was a woman whom the family had barely even heard of. She claimed to be a close associate of Chris, but her sudden appearance and her immediate attempt to claim his entire fortune made the family incredibly suspicious. They immediately went to the police and demanded a full investigation. The detectives assigned to the case realized that something was seriously wrong. They began by reconstructing Chris's final days, trying to figure out exactly who he had been spending time with before he fell ill. They obtained security camera footage from several locations that Chris had visited during his vacation. As they reviewed the footage, they found something incredibly suspicious. They looked at cameras from a popular high-end shopping district called Marina Square, where Chris had spent an afternoon. In the footage, Chris could be seen walking through the open-air mall carrying his luxury Louis Vuitton bag. But he was not alone. Walking just a few paces behind him was a woman wearing a very distinctive, bright purple dress. Later in the footage, the detectives saw Chris and the woman in the purple dress sitting together at an outdoor cafe. They were engaged in a friendly conversation. At one point, the woman stood up, walked over to the counter, and ordered 2 drinks. She returned to the table and handed Chris a cup of matcha tea. The cameras captured Chris taking several large sips of the drink while the woman watched him intently. It turns out this suspect had a very cunning way of gathering information. She had visited the very same dentist's office where Chris was a patient. By pretending to be a family member or simply by exploiting a moment of distraction when the receptionist stepped away from the front desk, she managed to catch a glimpse of Chris's patient file. This file contained sensitive personal information, including his full name, date of birth, home address, and financial details. This was the key she needed to begin her fraudulent scheme. She was a woman who was drowning in debt, living far beyond her means, and she desperately wanted to maintain a high society lifestyle without actually working for it. With this new lead, the detectives knew they had to halt any plans for Chris's burial and order a comprehensive forensic autopsy, specifically requesting an advanced toxicological analysis. When the lab results finally came back, they completely shattered the initial theory of an accidental death. The medical examiner discovered that Chris's body contained highly lethal levels of methanol mixed with a stabilizing compound known as methyl cellulose. Methanol is an incredibly dangerous chemical. It is a highly toxic form of alcohol that is commonly found in industrial solvents, windshield wiper fluid, and even high-end nail polishes, which are sometimes imported as German polish. It is a silent and deadly poison because when it is ingested, the body metabolizes it into formaldehyde and then into formic acid. This acid directly attacks the optic nerves, which explains why Chris experienced such sudden and terrifying vision loss before his vital organs shut down. The presence of methyl cellulose was also a critical detail, as it is a chemical thickener. The killer had likely used it to keep the methanol suspended in the drink and to alter the texture, making it harder for Chris to notice that his matcha tea had been laced with a deadly chemical. The detectives now knew they were dealing with a premeditated murder. They went back to the rental home and searched the trash bins, eventually finding the discarded paper cup from the matcha tea that Chris had been drinking on the day he fell ill. The forensic laboratory tested the residue inside the cup, and the results confirmed their suspicions. The cup was heavily contaminated with traces of methanol and methyl cellulose. The focus of the investigation shifted entirely to the mysterious woman in the purple dress. The police identified her and obtained a search warrant for her home and all of her personal electronic devices, including her Apple computer. The digital forensics team took her Apple computer and began a deep dive into the hard disk. What they found on that hard drive was absolutely devastating. The suspect had not been careful. Her search history was filled with incredibly incriminating queries. Over the weeks leading up to Chris's death, she had searched for phrases like how to buy pure methanol online, what is the lethal dose of methanol for an older man, how long does it take for methanol to kill someone, and can an autopsy detect methyl cellulose? She had also spent hours researching how to make a chemical poisoning look like a natural heart attack or stroke. The digital forensics unit had to use advanced data recovery software to search the hard disk of her Apple computer. The suspect thought she was clever because she had deleted her search history and emptied her trash bin before the police arrived. But she did not realize that when you delete a file on a computer, the data remains on the hard drive until it is overwritten by new information. The forensic experts were able to recover every single deleted file, including her web searches, her online purchase receipts for the industrial methanol, and the drafts of the forged beneficiary forms. They even found a digital log showing the exact dates and times she had accessed Chris's financial accounts to change his beneficiary information. With all of this evidence, the detectives were able to reconstruct exactly how this horrific crime had taken place. The woman in the purple dress had met Chris through his travel business and immediately saw him as an opportunity to secure a life of luxury. She spent months befriending him, gaining his trust, and learning his daily routines. She found out about his $3 million net worth and decided that she wanted it all for herself. She carefully planned the murder, purchasing the industrial methanol and methyl cellulose online. She knew that Chris loved matcha tea, which has a very strong earthy flavor and a naturally thick texture. She realized that this would be the perfect vehicle for the poison, as the strong taste of the matcha would easily mask the harsh chemical burn of the methanol, and the natural thickness would disguise the addition of the methyl cellulose. On the day of the murder, she wore her eye-catching purple dress and met Chris at Marina Square. She acted like a caring friend, buying him his favorite matcha tea and secretly slipping the pre-measured lethal dose of poison into his cup. She watched him drink it, knowing that she had just signed his death warrant. She then escorted him back to his rental, where she left him to die a slow, agonizing death. She believed that because methanol poisoning mimics the symptoms of other medical emergencies, the doctors would write it off as a natural death, especially given Chris's age. She figured the body would be quickly cremated or buried, and she would be free to claim the $3 million and live a life of luxury, perhaps buying her own high-end vehicles like a Ford Raptor or traveling the world. But her greed and overconfidence led to her downfall. She did not realize that the security cameras at Marina Square had captured her every move, and she did not expect the detectives to thoroughly analyze her Apple computer's hard disk. During the highly publicized trial, the prosecutors presented the security camera footage from Marina Square and the deleted digital evidence recovered from the hard disk of her Apple computer. The defense team tried to claim that Chris had accidentally consumed the methanol from a household product like German polish, but the exact chemical trace found in his body matched the precise recipe on the suspect's hard drive. The jury quickly found her guilty of first-degree murder, financial fraud, and forgery, and the judge sentenced her to life in prison without parole. While justice was eventually served, the emotional pain remained for Chris's grieving family. The $3 million estate was returned to his heirs, but his empty Ford Raptor truck and his signature Louis Vuitton bag sat as silent reminders of a vibrant life cut tragically short by sheer greed. They are left with the haunting lesson that sometimes the most dangerous people stand closest to us, wearing a friendly smile and offering a warm drink. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Bill Vail has always been an incredibly scientifically minded person. He's the kind of guy who trusts data, logic, and proven facts. He's had technical jobs his entire life, jobs that required precision and a clear analytical mind. For 15 years, he worked for NASA as a robotics engineer. He even spent some time as a pilot for NASA. If you ask his family and friends, they'll tell you with respect that Bill sort of lacks an imagination. He's not a creative person. He's pragmatic, he's to the point, and he's all about facts. He doesn't have time for anything that can't be explained or proven. In 2002, Bill's life took an unexpected turn. He and his wife separated, and the change caught him completely off guard. It threw him into something of a midlife crisis. For years, his work at NASA had been the most fulfilling part of his life, but now, with his family life crumbling, a huge void opened up. He started questioning everything. He looked around and thought, what am I even doing all this for? I don't have a family anymore. So, he made a big decision. He decided to move back to his hometown of Arlington, Texas, where his younger brother lived. He needed a fresh start, a way to reset his life. Once he got to Arlington, things started to feel a little bit better. Having family around made him feel less lonely. He wasn't sure what he wanted to do with his career long term, so he took a job at his brother's water purification company. It was a way to keep busy, to do something productive while he figured out his next steps. It was a big change from being a robotics engineer at NASA, but he found that working day in and day out with his brother was comforting. It was exactly what he needed at that moment in his life. He was just settling in, trying to build a new routine for himself. Bill had only been living in Arlington for a couple of months and had been at the water purification company for just a few weeks. One Saturday, a house call came into the company. It was late in the day, and nobody really wanted to take it. Bill saw it as an opportunity. He figured he'd take one for the team, make a good impression on his new coworkers. So, he volunteered for the job. Part of his role was to go to customers' homes and demonstrate how to install and use their new water purification system. It was a straightforward task, something he could do easily. But this particular house call started off a little strange. The dispatcher at the company pulled him aside. She told him, hey, listen, this is a bit weird, but the person who called was very specific. They were adamant that you have to be there at exactly 5 o'clock. Not a minute earlier, not a minute later. It was only about 3 in the afternoon at that point. Bill asked her what he was supposed to do for the next 2 hours. She just shrugged and said, I don't know. Go grab a bite to eat or something. Just make sure you are there right at 5. So that's what he did. He thought it was an odd request, but a customer is a customer. He drove around for a while, killed some time, and then parked his car down the street from the address. He watched the clock. A couple of minutes before 5, he got out of his car and started walking over to the property. It was a big brick house. As he walked up the path, right around 4:59 p.m., he started to hear something. He could hear screaming coming from inside the house. As he got closer to the front door, he could tell it was slightly ajar, not fully latched. The sound was a woman's voice, and it sounded like she was screaming, "Get out of here!" Bill didn't really know what to make of it. He had a job to do. So, he walked up to the steps, and even though the door was already open, he knocked. Now, standing right there, he could clearly hear through the crack in the door that someone inside was screaming over and over again. He hesitated for a moment. He listened. Finally, he decided he should probably just open the door and make sure everything was okay. The screaming was alarming, and the door was open. It seemed like the right thing to do. He pushed the door open and took one step inside. He peered around a corner and could see a little way down the hall. Off to the right, there was an opening to a room. And in that room, he saw an unbelievable scene. There were 3 men on their knees, arranged in a small circle. A woman was walking around them, also in a circle. She was holding a book in her hand, and she was speaking in tongues. It was just nonsensical language, nothing he could understand. But every so often, as she circled the men and touched each of their heads, she would scream, "Get out of here! Leave these people! Get out of here!" Bill was about to turn around and leave. This was way too weird for him. He wanted no part of whatever this was. But just before he could back out the door, the woman who was circling the men looked up. She looked directly at him. She pointed a finger straight at him and didn't break eye contact. She just held her finger out, aimed right at his chest. And in that moment, Bill felt this very strange, very strong sense that this woman wanted to harm him. It was a purely instinctual feeling, but it was overwhelming. He didn't wait for a second thought. He just turned and ran out the door. He got back to his car and immediately called the dispatcher. He told her, "Okay, I just went on the most insane house call of my life. The lady in there is crazy. I am not doing it. Don't you dare reschedule it. And if you do, do not put me on it, because I will not go back in there." Bill, being the straightforward guy he was, tried not to let his imagination get the better of him. He told himself those people were just crazy, and it wasn't his business. It wasn't his problem. So, he tried to forget about it. He drove home, turned on the TV, got a microwave dinner out of the freezer, and just sat there eating his food, trying to have a nice, quiet Saturday night to himself. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something in his other room. Now, you have to remember, Bill lived completely alone. He had no pets, but he was sure he saw something small dart across the ground. He couldn't quite tell if it was flying or running, but he saw movement. He just thought, "Oh, great. Now I've got some kind of rodent or maybe a bird in my house. It must have snuck in through the chimney or something." Bill wasn't scared. He was mostly just frustrated. Now he had to deal with getting some animal out of his house. He put his food down, turned on all the lights, because he'd been watching TV in the dark, and started to search. He moved quietly, listening for any sign of it, any scurrying sounds, trying to figure out where the thing went. But he couldn't hear a thing. After searching for over an hour, he just gave up. He thought, maybe I didn't even see it in the first place. Maybe my eyes were just playing tricks on me. Later that night, he was asleep in his bed when he suddenly woke up. He felt what seemed like a small creature running over the foot of his bed right across his feet. It was so distinct that it woke him up instantly. His first instinct was to pull his legs up to his chest, tucking them under the covers, just like anyone would do if some random animal ran across them in the middle of the night. He thought, great. This thing, whatever it is, it's probably a rat. And now it's in my bedroom, on my bed. He was more angry than anything else. This was the last thing he needed in the middle of the night. He flipped on the lights, ready to find this thing and get it out of his room. He searched everywhere. He looked under his dresser. He looked in the closet. He got down on his hands and knees and looked under the bed. He stopped every few moments to listen, but he couldn't hear any scurrying, nothing at all. He started to question himself again. Did I imagine that too? I mean, I thought I saw something dart across the room earlier when I was watching TV. And just now, could that have just been part of a dream? He wasn't fully awake when it happened. He woke up to the sensation. So he started to convince himself that he was somehow creating this weird thought in his head. He probably didn't see anything downstairs, and he was probably just having a dream about a rodent in his house, and that's what made him think something had touched his feet. So he just told himself, all right, whatever, turned off the lights, and went back to bed. Bill managed to fall back asleep, but it wasn't for long. A short time later, he woke up again when his entire bed started shaking violently. He shot up, wide awake, and as soon as he was conscious, the shaking stopped. His first thought was that there was an earthquake. He jumped out of bed, looking around to see if things were going to start falling off the shelves. He ran to the window and looked outside, but he couldn't tell what was going on. He ran into the other room, and in his slight panic, he could tell that the shaking was completely gone. The house was totally silent. He went back to his bed and had a strange thought. Could I have somehow shaken the bed myself in my sleep? He had one of those huge, heavy four-poster beds. He was a big, strong guy, and he tried to move it himself, but he could barely make it budge. He had this distinct memory of the bed literally shaking back and forth. Now, this was the third strange thing that had happened, and he couldn't make sense of any of it. Being the pragmatic person he was, with no wild imagination to speak of, he decided to find a logical explanation. He thought, okay, let's find out if there was an earthquake. He went to his computer and started searching online for recent earthquake reports. He figured if it had just happened, the news would be breaking right then and there, some headline would pop up. But there was nothing. Not a single report. So he moved on to other possibilities. Okay, he thought, what other rational things could have caused my house to shake? He remembered that there was a military airbase a couple of miles from his house. He considered that maybe a fighter jet was taking off, and the sonic boom from it accelerating could have caused the vibration. He wasn't sure if that was it, but it seemed possible. Then he thought about all the oil rigs drilling in the area. Maybe there had been some kind of accident at one of them. He started researching recent accidents at local oil rigs. He was just desperately trying to find a rational scientific explanation for why his bed was shaking. He also couldn't stop thinking about the thing he thought he saw, the thing that touched his feet. He wasn't connecting the two events directly, but he had this unsettling feeling that either something was seriously wrong with him and he was losing his mind, or something really, really weird was happening on his property. As he was in the middle of this research, trying to find a logical answer, his internet connection went out. He tried troubleshooting it a few times, but he couldn't get it to work. So he had to call his service provider to see if they could fix it from their end. He got through to customer service, and someone picked up. They confirmed, yep, it looks like your internet is out. Let me fix that for you. I'm just going to put you on a brief hold. So they put him on hold. He was sitting there, listening to that typical staticky elevator music when the sound started to change. A strange, staticky noise came through the receiver. It was nothing significant at first, but then a voice started speaking. It was speaking in tongues, just like the woman at the house call. It was nonsensical language, and it sounded almost threatening. Bill was totally unsettled by this voice. It just went on and on. He'd been on hold for about 2 minutes now, just listening to this bizarre voice. He finally just hung up the phone. Just a few seconds later, his phone rang. It was the same customer service representative he had just been speaking to. The rep had a distinct accent, so Bill knew it was him. Bill asked, "Hey, was I just talking to you?" The customer service rep sounded a little flustered. He said, "Yeah, sorry about that, we got disconnected." Bill then asked, "Did you hear that voice? Did you hear that strange voice on the phone?" The customer service rep, who usually stuck to a script, seemed to deviate for a moment. He said, "Actually, yes, I did hear that." He went on to explain that he was trying to figure out how it was even possible because they used a very secure phone line to talk to customers. He said there was really no way for someone to block his ability to speak to Bill. Even if someone had somehow gotten on the call, Bill should have still been able to hear him. The rep said, "I was trying to yell to you, but you weren't hearing me." "I definitely heard the voice. I don't know what that was, and we're very sorry." So both of them were clearly weirded out by it. But the customer service rep had a job to do. He told Bill, "Hey, your internet is working again. Thanks for calling." He hung up, and Bill was left with his internet working, but now he had a fourth strange event to deal with. The thing that ran across the room. The thing that ran across his feet. The shaking bed. And now this devil-like voice speaking in tongues on the phone, which crucially the customer service rep had also heard. He decided he was done doing research for the night. It was something like 3 a.m. He just wanted to try and get a couple of hours of sleep. This was all starting to freak him out. So Bill got back into his bed. He was trying to sleep, but he couldn't stop thinking about the 4 strange things that had happened in just a few hours. He couldn't help but start to feel a little bit worried. He felt like something he didn't understand was going on, and it felt bad. As he was lying there, desperately trying to fall asleep, he swore he could hear some kind of sound coming from underneath his bed. He knew it could be his mind playing tricks on him, but it didn't matter. He thought he heard it, and at that point, he was officially spooked. Like a little kid, he pulled the covers up over his head. He was just lying on his bed with the covers pulled tight, basically trying to convince himself that this wasn't happening. There's nothing under your bed, just relax. He had his legs pulled up near his chest, completely under the sheets. The way he was positioned was important. He had left a light on in his room, and the light was beaming down onto the sheet that was covering the upper part of his body. This created a little bit of light inside the cavern under his sheets. So, as he was holding the covers up over his head, trying to tell himself that nothing was going on, he looked down towards the foot of his bed under the covers, and he saw a hand. It was slowly reaching up from the side of the bed. It came up, and it sort of grabbed for his foot. It just missed, and then it retracted back out from under the bed. Bill literally leaped out of his bed. He flipped on every single light in the room and was now in absolute crisis mode. He immediately backed himself up against the wall. He didn't even want to look under the bed, but eventually he forced himself to. He kind of poked his head down and looked. There was nothing there. He searched his entire room again. There was no sign that anybody had been in there. And now he was at a loss. He had experienced so many strange occurrences, and none of them made any sense. He had no idea what to do next. Bill did not even attempt to go back to bed that night. He went downstairs, turned on every light in the entire house, and started drinking coffee. He was determined to stay awake. The next day, he just tried to have a normal day. He didn't want to think about what had happened the night before. He went to work like usual and didn't tell anyone about it. Again, Bill was a straight shooter. He wasn't about to be the former NASA robotics engineer who starts telling people about paranormal stuff happening in his house. He was doing everything he could to not think like that. By the end of the day, though, as he was getting ready to go home, he started to feel a bit of anxiety. He knew he would have to potentially face more of the strange things that happened the night before. He got home and immediately turned on all his lights. He was not about to sit in the dark. He was sitting in the same chair he always sat in, the one where he first saw that thing dart across the room. He was eating his microwave dinner and watching TV again with all the lights in his house blazing. He looked down for just a second to take another bite of his food. And when he looked back up, a bottle was flying through the air straight towards his head. He instinctively moved his head out of the way, and the bottle hit the wall right beside him. It was a glass bottle, and it shattered all over the ground. And at that exact moment, all the lights in the house went out. Bill ran to the closet where he knew he kept a flashlight. He opened the door, reached in for the flashlight, and as he was about to pull it out, he heard a loud slamming sound coming from the top of the closet. He had a couple of heavy boxes stored on the very top shelf. The sound was as if someone had lifted one of those boxes up and slammed it back down on the shelf. But obviously, he hadn't done it. It totally freaked him out. He grabbed the flashlight, shined it all around the closet. There was no one in there. There was nothing out of place. He backed out of the closet, and just then, the lights came back on. His heart was racing because he knew what had just happened. Someone, or something, had just thrown a bottle at his head. Something had just slammed a heavy box in his closet. He was in full panic mode. The only person he could think to call was his brother. He wasn't ready to go to the police. What would he even say? The things he would need to describe sounded completely nonsensical. But his brother Bob was also very rational, equally pragmatic in his approach to things. He called his brother and just said, "Get over here. I've got some weird stuff happening in my house, and I just need a sanity check." So his younger brother Bob came over. As soon as Bob got there, Bill didn't know how to start. He had never had a conversation about the paranormal with his brother before. So he just said, "All right, this is going to sound weird, Bob, but I need you to just go in this closet. Just go in the closet." Bob looked at him like he was crazy and asked what he was talking about. Bill just said, "Please just go in there. I'm going to shut the door, and I want you to just tell me what happens. Bob, seeing how distressed his brother was, agreed. "All right," he said, and he went into the closet. Bill shut the door behind him and just waited outside. After a moment, Bill called out to him, "Hey, turn off the light in there. There's a little pull string for a tiny light bulb." Bob turned off the light, and it was pitch black inside. Now, at the time, Bob would not tell Bill what happened to him in that closet. Mostly because, if you put yourself in Bob's shoes, he had no context for any of this. He had never experienced anything like it before. So, when things happened to him in there, he chalked it up to his own clumsiness. He was standing in the dark closet when he felt something hit his leg. He just thought, "Oh, I must have knocked into a pair of shoes or something." He just stood there, and then something hit him hard in the face. He thought, "I must have hit something on the top shelf, and it fell and hit me in the head." But the two things happening back to back did unsettle him a little bit. He made a conscious decision not to tell Bill what had happened. He thought it would only feed into his brother's paranoia, and that wasn't what he needed right now. He opened the closet door, stepped out, and said, "You know what, Bill? Nothing happened in there. You've got nothing to worry about. There's nothing in here." He left, and Bill was left feeling kind of crestfallen. He felt like he hadn't done a good job of conveying to his brother just how serious the situation was. He felt out of his element and didn't know how to handle it. He had only one other person he felt comfortable talking to about this, mostly because the whole situation was just embarrassing for him. He was this esteemed former NASA employee. The last thing he wanted was for people to think he was losing his mind. But he had a friend named Michael who was a sound engineer for a couple of podcasts. When he called him, Bill didn't even really know what he was going to say. He just needed to talk to a friendly voice. Michael was a little surprised to get a call from Bill. They made some small talk, and then Bill just said, "You know, I don't know how to approach this with you, but I just moved to Arlington, and I've got some weird stuff going on in my house. I guess I'm just telling you because I don't know what else to do." Michael was a bit caught off guard, and was mostly just worried about his friend. He started asking some basic questions, like what Bill had heard or seen, not really sure if it was worth exploring, but just trying to be a good friend. As they were having this conversation, the same voice that had come on the phone during the call to the internet company came on the line again. All of a sudden, Bill couldn't hear Michael, and Michael couldn't hear Bill. All they could both hear was this angry, demonic-sounding voice that was very threatening. Michael, being a sound engineer, instinctively thought to record it. He had all his equipment right there. He grabbed a microphone, put it up to the receiver, and started recording. He sat there for a minute and a half recording this voice. About 30 seconds into the recording, Bill, on the other end, who had heard this voice before and was starting to get the feeling that this whole thing was really bad, started yelling into the phone. He was yelling for Michael to hang up. "Don't listen to this. Hang up. Hang up the phone. Don't listen to the voice!" After about a minute and a half of this chaos, the voice suddenly stopped. The line went back to normal, and Bill and Michael could hear each other again, crystal clear. Michael immediately said, "Hey, Bill, are you there?" Bill said, "Yeah, I'm here. I was trying to get you to get off the phone. You can't listen to this stuff. I don't know what it is, but it's bad." And Michael just said, "No, listen. I recorded that. Here, let me play it back for you." He started playing the recording back, and all it was silence, except for the parts where Bill was yelling, "Don't listen to it! Hang up!" And Michael was yelling at the beginning, "Hey, what is that? What is this?" The recording had only picked up their own voices. The demonic, possessed-sounding voice was completely gone from the audio. At this point, Bill was starting to get genuinely scared. He wouldn't admit it, but he was alone in this house with all this strange stuff happening. He decided to invite his brother over for dinner again. He thought having other people in the house might help. So Bob and his wife Cindy came over. Bill was sitting in his usual chair, and Bob and Cindy were on the couch. They were having a nice time, just watching TV. Bill remembered feeling how nice it was just to have other people there. As they were watching, Bill suddenly stood up and ran over to the room where he had originally seen that thing dart by. Bob and Cindy saw him jump up and run over, and they asked, "Hey, what did you see?" "What was that?" Bill tried to explain. He said, "I don't know how to describe what I saw, but I saw this thing that's in my house." "Bob, this is why I brought you over here. I've been seeing this animal or something running around, and I swear I just saw it again." He pointed to his chair. "Hey, look, Bob, sit in my chair." It was the only place in the room with a clear vantage point into that other room. From the couch where Bob and Cindy were sitting, you couldn't really see into it. Bill said, "Just listen to me. Sit in my seat and just watch the TV. Don't pay attention to the room, just watch TV and see if something catches your eye. Maybe I'm seeing something totally rational, but something is happening. Just do what I was doing." Bob was skeptical, but agreed. "All right," he said, and he sat in the chair. Bill sat down next to Cindy on the couch, and they all started watching TV again. After just a few minutes, Bob suddenly reacted, clearly seeing something in the other room. He jumped up and said, "Oh my God, what is that?" They all stood up, and Bill asked him, "Well, what did you see?" Bob was shaken. He said, "I don't know. It was like some kind of small animal or something, but it looked like it was on 2 feet. It didn't look like a 4-legged animal. That was a 2-legged animal." What was that? Now Bob was starting to believe. He was thinking about what happened to him in the closet, the things he didn't tell Bill about. Now this. He turned to his wife and said, "Okay, Cindy, you sit in the seat. You do this now." So Cindy sat in the chair, and Bill and Bob sat on the couch watching her. Sure enough, in just a matter of minutes, she saw it too. She saw something dart across the other room. Now, was she just jumping on the bandwagon because the other two saw it? Maybe. But she described the exact same thing they did, a small bipedal creature running through the dining room. The three of them turned on all the lights and started searching the entire house. They were determined to find this thing. They searched everywhere for hours, but they couldn't find a single trace of it. Finally, it was getting late, and Bob and Cindy knew they had to leave. They said, "Hey, Bill, I don't know what's happening in your house, but why don't you just come stay with us tonight? We have a guest room. Just crash with us, and you can come back in the morning and call animal control or whatever you want to do. You shouldn't be here alone tonight." In a way, Bill was actually happy. He finally had someone he trusted, his own family, who had confirmed that they were seeing the same things he was. It was terrifying to think there was some creature in his house, but at least he knew he wasn't losing his mind. Or if he was, at least other people were too. He was relieved. But he told them, "You know what? I'm not going to go with you. I don't want to just give up my house. What will I do when I come back if it just keeps happening? I don't want to just give up." So Bob and Cindy left, and Bill was alone again. But now he was determined. For the first time, he started looking up paranormal explanations for what was happening. He quickly realized that just searching for the paranormal online was useless. There were too many things, and it was impossible to tell what was credible and what wasn't. There was no fact-checking, just people posting stories. So he decided to change his approach. Instead of doing the research himself, he would find a paranormal investigative team, but he wanted a specific kind of team. He wanted one that approached their investigations like a scientist would, looking for an answer, even if that answer was totally normal, instead of just looking for proof that ghosts exist. He started searching for investigative paranormal teams with a scientific focus in his area of Texas. And he actually found one. He reached out to them, and they were available to come over that very night. He told them, "Please, come over. I need your help." The leader of the paranormal team was a man named Brian Hall. When they arrived, it was Brian and a couple of his crew members. They didn't start by diving into a paranormal investigation. They started by looking for obvious, rational answers. They had found that many times what people think is a paranormal event is actually something simple, like a bad air conditioning unit, a creaky door, or a tree branch rubbing against the house. They did a very long and thorough examination of the entire house, inside and out, looking for things like that. They determined that there was nothing obvious that could provide a rational explanation. So now it was time to set up their equipment. They set up a couple of cameras in Bill's bedroom, since that's where a lot of the activity seemed to be happening. They also set up these special laser beams that projected a grid of lasers in every direction. They placed them in his bedroom so that there were laser beams crisscrossing the entire room. The idea was that if anything, no matter how small, walked past any of these lasers, you would see the beams move, and it would be very obvious. It was a way to detect motion in the room. They set up the beams, started the cameras, and they waited. For a long time, absolutely nothing happened. Bill, Brian Hall, and the rest of the team were just sitting in the dining room downstairs, listening to silence and watching the monitors, seeing nothing. So Brian suggested something. He said, "Hey, why don't one of my team members go up there and just interact with the room a little bit? Go in there, yell a bit, do something to kind of stir it up, so to speak, and we'll see if anything happens." One of the team members went up to the room and walked in. He said, "Hey, is anybody in here?" Nothing happened. On the footage, you can see him jump onto the bed and sit there. At one point, as he's yelling out to whatever might be in the room, "Hey, if you're in here, show yourself," all of a sudden, on camera, you hear one of the laser projectors fall to the ground. He jumps out of bed and runs out of the room. The rest of the team came running up. They gathered up the cameras and immediately went to watch the footage. As they were watching, they saw something that the team member in the room hadn't seen at all. They saw a mist begin to form in the room. The mist started swirling in front of the laser beams right on camera just before you hear the sound of the laser projector falling to the ground off camera. At first, they were just dumbfounded. They were wondering how the mist got in there, what it was. They considered if maybe the laser beam had just rolled off a table, if it had been positioned in a way that it could have fallen on its own. They raised the sound levels on the video, and they were able to make out a couple of words being spoken, though it was faint. At this point, Brian Hall and his team felt like they had a good amount of data that did lend credibility to the idea that there was something paranormal happening in Bill's house. As they were packing up their equipment to leave, they said to Bill, "You've got to go. You can't stay here." "I'm surprised you're still here now." But Bill was just this incredibly prideful guy. He told them, "No, I'm going to stay. I've made the decision. I'm not going to run. I'm going to stay here in this house." They told him it was a bad idea. And honestly, they were right, because some pretty horrible stuff happened after they left. That night, Bill knew he wasn't going to sleep. He had all the lights on in his bedroom. He was sitting on his bed with his knees tucked up to his chin. He had upbeat classical music playing on a radio right next to his bed, just trying to create some kind of good vibes in the room. As he was sitting there, he heard a sound like a Mack truck smashing into the side of his house. It was so loud, so deafening, that he instantly sprinted out of his door, ran downstairs, and ran outside to inspect the damage to his property. But there was nothing outside. There was no Mack truck. There was no damage to his house. Nothing. He walked all around his property looking for any explanation. Did something fall on the street? Am I losing my mind? What is going on? After looking around for a while and finding nothing, he went back inside. As soon as he stepped foot back in his house, he heard a similarly loud crashing sound as if a vehicle was smashing into his house, but this time it was inside, in his dining room. It was the same room where he first saw that creature running across the ground. He ran in there expecting to find horrible damage, but there was nothing disturbed. Nothing was shaking, nothing was out of place. His dining room was completely intact. As he was standing there trying to process this, he heard his car alarm go off outside. And now he started to think, this thing is just messing with me. I'm not going to let it win. I've stayed here against better judgment for days. I'm not going to give in now. So Bill kind of went into fight mode. He was mad now. Instead of being scared of what was happening, he started screaming at the top of his lungs, "Show yourself!" As he was doing that, he heard yet another loud crashing sound, this time from up in his bedroom. He ran upstairs, ready to fight with whatever this was. He had reached a breaking point. He charged into his room, but there was nothing in there. But unlike the dining room and outside, the crashing sound continued while he was in the bedroom. He was standing there, holding his ears because of the deafening crashing sounds happening over and over and over again, but there was nothing moving in the room. There was no way for that sound to be coming from that room, but it was. After what felt like an eternity of this horrible smashing sound, it just completely stopped. It was dead silent. Bill slowly lifted his hands off his ears. He looked around, expecting the noise to start again, but it didn't. There was just dead silence throughout the entire house. After a long while, when he still didn't hear anything, he got back in his bed. All the lights were still on, his radio was still playing. He tucked his legs up to his chin and was just holding himself, basically in the fetal position. At this point, he was petrified. He'd had his big moment of fighting back, but now he was thinking that this thing was just challenging him in return. It was basically saying, I can do whatever I want to you and you can't touch me. He was realizing that he might have just made things worse. He was sitting there, knowing he wasn't going to sleep. It was still the middle of the night, and he started to hear a noise. It sounded like shuffling feet. Something was moving around underneath his bed. As he was sitting on his bed, at the head of the bed near his pillow, with his feet tucked in, he looked towards the foot of his bed, and this huge, wide, 6-foot-tall black figure emerged. It was in a brightly lit room, but this figure was pure black. It emerged at the foot of his bed. It had this huge tooth coming out of its mouth. It got into this jerky, unnatural position and started moving towards Bill. It got right in front of him. It put its face right up against Bill's face, then it let out a grunt, and then it just disappeared. Bill continued to see this horrible black figure in his house. It continued to challenge him, but Bill stopped challenging it back. He started waking up with scratches on his chest. He was even hospitalized a couple of times, which prompted the hospital to do welfare checks on him. He was showing up with what doctors thought were mini heart attacks brought on by the extreme stress he claimed was from having this stuff happen to him. His family was incredibly concerned. It wasn't until Bill started doing some really aggressive research on demons that he read about exorcism. And he remembered. He remembered that when he showed up for that house call, a lot of the language he was hearing from that screaming woman, "Leave these people, leave this house," it sounded like an exorcism. He started to wonder, is it possible that the woman performing the exorcism knew that she needed to find another host for these demons? Did she plan it so that this water purification person would show up at exactly 5 p.m. so that she could be at the right point in her ritual to cast the demons onto him? He had 2 exorcisms performed on his own house, but it still hasn't stopped. To this day, he is still dealing with the paranormal activity in his home. When he's asked why he has never sold the house, he says that he couldn't live with himself if he ever put another person through what he has dealt with in that house. He feels a responsibility to contain it. He has lived in that house for over 18 years since these events began, enduring it all rather than passing the horror on to someone else. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. To start our story, we have to look at a 28-year-old man named Artyom Sidorkin. Now, Artyom lived in Russia in a city called Izhevsk, which is located in the Ural region. He was a pretty normal guy who loved his work. He was a botanist, which meant he spent a vast majority of his time studying plants, trees, flowers, and the local flora of the region. He was passionate about nature, and he lived a very quiet, simple, and predictable life. He spent his days working in greenhouses, researching plant genetics, and taking walks through the dense Russian forests. But in the spring of 2009, something began to go very wrong with Artyom's health. It started with a very subtle, dull ache in his chest. At first, he tried to ignore it. We all do this when we get a little sick. We tell ourselves that we just slept wrong, or maybe we pulled a muscle while lifting something heavy at work. But for Artyom, the pain did not go away. In fact, it started getting worse with every single breath he took. Over the course of a few weeks, the dull ache transformed into a sharp, burning, stabbing sensation deep inside his right lung. It felt as though someone was taking a hot needle and poking him from the inside every time his chest expanded. Along with the pain came a persistent, hacking cough. At first, it was just a dry, irritating tickle in his throat, but it quickly escalated into deep, chest-racking coughs that left him completely exhausted and gasping for air. One morning, while sitting at his kitchen table trying to drink some tea, a particularly violent coughing fit seized him. He grabbed a white paper towel, covered his mouth, and coughed heavily. When he pulled the paper towel away, his heart sank. The paper was covered in bright red, fresh blood. The sight of the blood sparked instant panic. He realized he could no longer pretend this was just a minor chest cold or a pulled muscle. He put on his coat, walked out of his apartment, and made his way to the emergency room of the local hospital. When he arrived, the medical staff took one look at him and knew he was in serious trouble. He was incredibly pale, sweating, and hunched over, clutching his chest in obvious agony. Because of his age, his severe chest pain, and the fact that he was coughing up blood, the doctors immediately jumped to a very dark conclusion. In a young, otherwise healthy man, these specific symptoms almost always pointed to a highly aggressive, advanced stage of cancer. They feared he had a massive, fast-growing tumor inside his thoracic cavity that was actively eroding his airways. The doctors immediately ordered a chest x-ray to see what was going on inside his lungs. A short time later, the radiologist placed the film on the light box and examined the images. Sure enough, there was a distinct, solid, shadowy mass measuring about 5 centimeters in length, sitting right in the middle of Artyom's right lung. The boundaries of the mass were irregular and jagged, which is a classic visual indicator of a malignant, cancerous tumor. The medical team sat Artyom down and broke the devastating news. They told him they were almost certain he was facing a life-threatening, aggressive form of lung cancer. However, before they could schedule a major invasive surgery to cut out a large portion of his lung, they needed to perform a biopsy. This procedure would involve navigating a scope into his lung, snipping off a small piece of the mysterious mass, and sending it to a pathology lab to determine exactly what kind of cancer they were dealing with. Artyom was absolutely terrified. He was only 28 years old, with his entire life ahead of him, and suddenly he was staring down a potential death sentence. He spent the next few days in a state of deep depression, contemplating his own mortality and wondering how much time he had left. On the day of the procedure, he was wheeled into the operating room and placed under general anesthesia. The surgeon made the necessary incisions and carefully navigated into the right lung. When the surgeon located the mass, he used his instruments to carefully excise a portion of the tissue. He pulled the specimen out of Artyom's body and placed it onto a sterile metal tray. But as the surgeon looked down at the tissue sitting on the tray, his brow furrowed. It did not look like any cancerous tumor he had ever seen in his career. The tissue was red and inflamed, but it was shaped almost like a small envelope, as if it was holding something inside of itself. There was also a strange, vibrant hint of green color peeking through the bloody tissue. The surgeon reached for his forceps and gently parted the surrounding tissue to see what was hidden inside. When he opened it up, he froze in absolute disbelief. He literally stopped breathing for a moment, unable to comprehend what his eyes were showing him. Tucked neatly inside the tissue of Artyom's right lung was a living, breathing, bright green Siberian fir tree. It was 5 centimeters long, perfectly formed, and looked incredibly healthy. It had vibrant needles and was actively thriving in the warm, moist environment. The medical team quickly put the pieces of the puzzle together. Because Artyom was a botanist, he spent a tremendous amount of time around various plants, soil, and seeds. At some point during his work or his walks in the forest, he had accidentally inhaled a tiny microscopic seed of a Siberian fir tree. Instead of going down his esophagus or being coughed back out, the tiny seed had traveled deep into his bronchial tubes and lodged itself inside his lung tissue. The human lung is warm, dark, and highly humid. It is, for all intents and purposes, a perfect natural greenhouse. The seed had germinated, taken root in the rich, blood-fed tissue of the lung, and began to grow. As the small tree expanded, its sharp pine needles began to prick and pierce the delicate blood vessels and capillaries surrounding it. Every time Artyom took a breath, his lung tissue would contract and press against the sharp needles, causing internal bleeding, severe stabbing pain, and the coughing up of blood. When Artyom woke up from the anesthesia, the doctors walked into his room. Instead of delivering a grim prognosis of terminal cancer, they showed him the tiny green tree they had removed from his chest. Artyom was utterly shocked. He told them he had never felt like he had a forest growing inside of him, but his overwhelming feeling was one of pure ecstatic relief. He was completely cancer-free, and after the successful removal of the tiny fir tree, he made a full recovery and went back to his quiet life as a botanist. Now, our next story is even more unbelievable, but instead of a physical medical mystery, it is a psychological maze that took decades to fully unravel. It begins with a woman named Pauline Dakin. Growing up in Vancouver, Canada in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Pauline always had this nagging, unsettling feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with her family. Her parents, Ruth and Warren, had an incredibly tumultuous marriage. Warren was a heavy drinker, and when he was under the influence, he became extremely violent, volatile, and prone to terrifying outbursts. The household was always thick with tension, and Pauline and her brother lived in constant fear of their father's temper. So, in 1970, when Pauline was only 5 years old, her mother Ruth decided she could no longer live this way. She packed up their belongings, took the children, and separated from Warren. They moved into a new house on the opposite side of Vancouver. Pauline believed that this would be the start of a peaceful, normal life where they no longer had to walk on eggshells. But instead of the tension dissipating, Pauline noticed that her mother's behavior began to change in a highly concerning way. Even though Warren was no longer in the picture, Ruth became intensely anxious, paranoid, and hypervigilant. She was constantly looking over her shoulder, checking the locks on the doors and windows multiple times a day, and whispering as if someone might be listening to their conversation. Then, in 1974, when Pauline was 9 years old, her mother came home one afternoon and made a sudden announcement. She told Pauline and her brother that they were going on a fun family vacation. She instructed them to pack up their favorite clothes and toys, and they loaded everything into the family van. They embarked on a massive, grueling drive across the country, traveling over 1,000 miles away from Vancouver to the city of Winnipeg. But when they finally arrived in Winnipeg, they didn't pull up to a hotel. Instead, they stopped at a modest house. Ruth led the children inside, sat them down, and broke the news. She told them they were never going back to Vancouver. Winnipeg was their new permanent home. Pauline and her brother were completely devastated and deeply confused. They asked why they had to leave their old life behind, and they pleaded to see their father, whom they still loved despite his violent outbursts. But Ruth simply looked at them with tears in her eyes and told them that this was the way it had to be, and that when they were old enough, she would explain everything to them. With no other choice, Pauline tried to adapt to her new reality in Winnipeg. Over the next 4 years, she had absolutely no contact with her father, and she began to slowly put down roots. She made close friends, settled into her new school, and was finally starting to feel like a normal, stable teenager. But just as she began to feel comfortable, her mother sat them down once more. Ruth looked utterly terrified, worse than ever before. She told them they had to pack their bags immediately and leave Winnipeg. This time, they were moving all the way to New Brunswick on the far eastern side of Canada, thousands of miles away. Ruth made Pauline and her brother swear a solemn oath of absolute secrecy. They were strictly forbidden from telling a single soul that they were leaving. But on the day of the move, Pauline was spending some final moments with her best friend Wendy. The emotional weight of disappearing without saying goodbye was too much for her to bear, and she let it slip to Wendy that she was moving away. When Ruth arrived at Wendy's house to pick Pauline up, the two young girls had to put on a desperate act. They forced themselves to exchange a very breezy, casual, and superficial goodbye, pretending they would see each other at school the next day, just so Ruth wouldn't suspect that Pauline had broken her promise of secrecy. They got into the car and drove away, leaving another life in ruins behind them. Once in New Brunswick, the family finally managed to put down roots and stayed there for several years. But the atmosphere of deep paranoia never truly left their home. Ruth remained incredibly anxious, constantly watching the street from behind the living room curtains and behaving as though some invisible, terrifying threat was always looming just outside their door. The children grew up in this shadow, never knowing what their mother was so desperately afraid of. Fast forward to 1988. Pauline is now 23 years old. She has carved out an independent life for herself, living about 2 hours away from her mother's home in New Brunswick. She is sharing an apartment with her boyfriend and working as a professional reporter for a local newspaper. She feels like she has finally escaped the bizarre anxiety of her childhood. One afternoon, her phone rings. It is her mother, Ruth. Ruth's voice is trembling, and she tells Pauline that she is staying at a local motel nearby and wants to meet with her immediately. She says, "I am finally ready to tell you the truth. I am ready to explain everything about your childhood and why we had to run." Pauline was incredibly intrigued and excited. This was a conversation that had been decades in the making. She hopped into her car and drove straight to the motel. When she arrived, she saw her mother pacing back and forth outside the room, looking extremely nervous and scanning the parking lot with intense suspicion. Pauline waved and walked up to her, about to speak, but Ruth quickly placed her finger over her lips, signaling her to be completely quiet. Without saying a single word, Ruth grabbed Pauline's hand and shoved a paper envelope into it. Written on the front of the envelope was a strict note: "Do not speak. Take off all of your jewelry, your watch, and anything made of metal and put it inside this envelope. It is highly likely that your jewelry is bugged with listening devices. I will explain everything once we are inside, but please do not say a single word." Pauline was utterly bewildered, but she did exactly as she was told. She took off her rings, her necklace, and her watch, slipped them into the envelope, and handed it back to her mother. In complete silence, they walked into the motel room. When they entered, Pauline saw a man sitting in the center of the room. She recognized him immediately. It was Stan Sears, the former reverend of the church they had attended back in Vancouver when she was a little girl. Ruth had worked as Stan's secretary for years, and Pauline knew they had always remained close friends who kept in touch. In fact, Pauline remembered seeing Stan show up unexpectedly in Winnipeg and New Brunswick over the years to visit her mother. But as they sat down, Ruth made a confession that shocked Pauline. She explained that she and Stan were actually deeply in love and had been carrying on a secret romantic relationship since their time in Vancouver. However, that revelation was nothing compared to what Ruth said next. She explained that the real reason they had been running and hiding for all these decades was because Pauline's father, Warren, was not just a violent alcoholic. He was actually a high-profile, powerful member of a massive organized crime syndicate in Vancouver, the Mafia. Ruth claimed that right after she separated from Warren, she discovered that the mob had put a contract out on her life. They believed that because she had left Warren, he could no longer control her, and they feared she knew too many of their dark secrets. They wanted her dead to ensure her silence. Stan also found out that he was a target. The mob discovered his secret relationship with Ruth, which made him a liability. Additionally, Stan had been counseling a man in his congregation who turned out to be a mobster wanting to leave the syndicate. When that man was suddenly assassinated, Stan realized that the mob knew he had been given highly sensitive information, making him an active target. Ruth and Stan decided they could not go to the police. They believed the mob had local law enforcement in their pocket, and they knew that families who turned to the police were brutally executed as an example. So, they chose to run and go into hiding together. When Ruth moved Pauline and her brother to Winnipeg and then to New Brunswick, Stan had actually moved along with them in tandem, staying close by to help protect them. Pauline sat there, completely stunned, trying to process this wild information. But as she thought about it, she realized this story actually explained so many of the bizarre, unexplained events from her childhood. She remembered coming home from school on multiple occasions to find her mother in a state of absolute panic, furiously pulling every single item of food out of the refrigerator and the pantry and throwing it all in the trash without any explanation. Now, Ruth explained that those were times they had received word that the mob had attempted to poison their food supply. Pauline also remembered being abruptly pulled out of school and enrolled in a different school across town on 6 different occasions. Ruth explained that those moves happened because they had received credible intelligence that the mob had discovered which school Pauline was attending, forcing them to scramble her location. By the end of the weekend, Pauline felt a strange mix of shock and relief. She finally had an answer to the chaos of her youth. But then her mother and Stan dropped another bombshell. They told her she was still in active danger, but they had taken steps to secure their safety. They explained that they had finally grown tired of living in constant hiding, so they had contacted a highly secret branch of the authorities. They had been placed into a special, classified witness protection program designed for families targeted by organized crime. They referred to the shadow program as entering the weird world. In this weird world, undercover agents would constantly follow them around, tracking their movements to ensure no hitmen could get close to them. Ruth told Pauline that because she and her brother were also targets, they had arranged for undercover agents to monitor them as well, even though they had been unaware of it. Stan reached into his bag and pulled out a heavy black radio. He handed it to Pauline and told her that this radio broadcasted directly to the agents assigned to watch her. He warned her that she must only use it in a life-or-death situation because the moment she called for help, federal agents would risk their lives and engage in a gunfight to save her. Pauline held the radio, her hands trembling. She looked at her mother and asked what had happened to her father, Warren. Was he in prison? Ruth shook her head and said no, he wasn't in jail. She explained that Warren had also been brought into the weird world, and she handed Pauline a handwritten letter. The letter was indeed from her father. It was addressed to Pauline, and in it he wrote about how he had been moved into this protective program and was looking forward to the day when Pauline would join them in the weird world. Completely overwhelmed, Pauline said goodbye to her mother and Stan and left the motel. She got into her car, but before she could start the engine, she saw Stan running out of the motel toward her, clutching a round object. He tapped on her window, and when she rolled it down, he handed her a magnetized round piece of metal. He told her it was a highly advanced GPS transponder. He instructed her to stick it out of sight underneath the frame of her car so that the undercover agents could constantly track her exact location and find her quickly if she was ever kidnapped by the mob. Pauline thanked him, placed the transponder under her car, and drove home. But living with this knowledge was incredibly agonizing. The paranoia began to consume her. Every car that drove behind her felt like a hitman. Every shadow in her apartment felt like an assassin. After just a few days of living in constant terror, Pauline couldn't take it anymore. She abruptly broke up with her boyfriend, quit her job at the newspaper, packed up her things, and moved into a new, isolated apartment. She called her mother and told her she wanted to join the weird world immediately. Her mother and Stan were delighted by her decision, but they told her that entering the program was a highly complex process. They said that many different high-level agents had to coordinate her transition, and they told her to be patient and wait for an agent to contact her. So, Pauline waited. She lived in isolation, checking her locks, clutching her radio, and waiting for the call. But days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. In fact, the waiting dragged on for 5 long years. During those 5 years, Pauline slowly began to rebuild a normal life. She met a kind man named Kevin, who eventually became her husband. As they spent long nights talking, Pauline decided to share her family's wild secret with him. But as Kevin listened to the details, he began to ask logical questions that Pauline had never considered. He asked why a secret government agency would keep her waiting for 5 years without any contact. He asked why they would use a civilian radio or a magnetic transponder instead of official government protocols. He suggested that something was deeply wrong with the story. Pauline wanted to believe her mother, but Kevin's questions sowed seeds of doubt. She realized she needed to know the truth once and for all. She decided to set up a clever sting operation to test her mother and Stan. She called her mother, crying and panting heavily, putting on an incredibly convincing performance. She told her that someone had just kicked in the door to her apartment, searched her things, and fled. She asked if she should call the local police. Ruth panicked and told her absolutely not to call the police. She said she would immediately get in touch with Stan so he could alert the undercover agents watching her building. Just a few minutes later, Ruth called back. She sounded incredibly relieved. She told Pauline that she had spoken to Stan, who had contacted the undercover agents stationed outside her apartment. Ruth said the agents had witnessed 2 mafia hitmen break into her apartment, but they had moved in quickly, tackled them, and taken both hitmen into custody. She assured Pauline that she was safe now. Pauline felt a cold, sinking feeling in her chest. She took a deep breath and said, "Mom, I made the whole thing up. Nobody broke into my apartment. I've been sitting here quietly all day. I lied to you." The line went dead silent. It was in that moment that the illusion shattered. Pauline realized that her entire life, since the age of 5, had been built on a massive, fabricated lie. There was no mafia, her father was not a hitman, and there were no undercover agents protecting them. It was all a fantasy. But as Pauline dug deeper, she discovered the incredibly complex psychological truth behind the lie. It turned out that Stan Sears was suffering from a rare mental health condition known as delusion syndrome. People with this condition can appear completely normal, highly intelligent, and perfectly lucid in their daily lives, but they harbor one single, fixed, unshakable delusion. In Stan's mind, he truly believed that the mafia was hunting him down. Because of his close relationship with Ruth, he had gradually passed this delusion on to her. This is a recognized, rare psychological phenomenon known as folie à deux, or madness for two. When a highly dominant, charismatic personality with a delusion is paired with a highly submissive, anxious partner, the partner can adopt the delusion as absolute reality. When Pauline later confronted both her mother and Stan, she expected them to break down and apologize for the decades of deception, but they didn't. They couldn't. To them, the danger was still absolute. They refused to believe Pauline's evidence, and they continued to live in fear. Their biggest worry after Pauline confronted them was not that their lie had been exposed, but rather that Pauline was putting herself in mortal danger by refusing to use her GPS transponder and radio. They genuinely believed she was going to be assassinated by the mob. Ruth and Stan eventually took this delusion to their graves, never once admitting it was a lie because their minds simply could not process reality. Pauline had to find a way to make peace with her bizarre childhood on her own. She did so by writing a best-selling memoir about her experiences titled Run, Hide, Repeat, which allowed her to finally close that chapter of her life. Our final story brings us to the quiet, scenic town of Del Mar, New York, in November of 2004. Del Mar was the kind of close-knit, peaceful suburb where people moved to raise their families. It was safe, the schools were excellent, and major crimes were virtually unheard of. This was the place that 52-year-old Peter Porco and his 54-year-old wife Joan called home. Peter and Joan were incredibly ordinary, hard-working, middle-class Americans. They lived in a beautiful, comfortable two-story house on a tree-lined street. They had been happily married for over 30 years and had built a wonderful life together. Peter was a highly respected appellate court clerk, known for his sharp mind, his gentle demeanor, and his absolute commitment to his job. Joan was a speech pathologist, a kind and patient woman who dedicated her life to helping children with speech impediments. The couple had 2 sons. Their oldest son, Jonathan, was 23 years old and was a proud naval officer stationed at a submarine base in Groton, Connecticut. Their younger son, Christopher, was 21 years old and was a student at the University of Rochester, located a few hours away. From the outside, the Porco family appeared to be the absolute model of success and happiness. But underneath that perfect exterior, a deeply disturbing dynamic was beginning to unfold. To understand the tragedy that took place, we have to look closely at the events of Monday, November 15, 2004. It began like any other chilly autumn morning. Peter Porco's alarm went off at his usual time, and he rose from his bed to start his well-rehearsed morning routine. Peter was a man of deep habit. He walked into the master bathroom, turned on the light, and relieved himself. He washed his hands, looked at his reflection in the mirror, and picked up his shaving cream. He lathered his face, took his razor, and carefully shaved his beard, rinsing the blade under the warm, running water, just as he had done thousands of times before. Once he was finished, he wiped his face dry with a clean towel and walked back into his bedroom to put on his neat, professional work clothes. With his clothes on, Peter quietly walked downstairs, taking care not to wake Joan, who was still asleep in their bed upstairs. The house was peaceful and quiet. He walked into the kitchen, grabbed the coffee pot, filled it with water, added fresh coffee grounds to the filter, and switched on the machine. As the rich scent of brewing coffee began to fill the kitchen, Peter decided to utilize those few quiet minutes to do some light housework. He went over to the dishwasher, which had finished its cleaning cycle the night before. He opened the door, pulled out the racks, and began systematically unloading the clean dishes. He placed the plates, bowls, and coffee mugs into their designated cabinets and neatly sorted the silverware into the drawer. Once the dishwasher was empty, he gathered the dirty cups and plates that had accumulated in the kitchen sink, loaded them inside, added detergent, and started a new cycle. By this time, his fresh pot of coffee was fully brewed. Peter poured himself a warm mug and decided he wanted to read the morning newspaper. The paper was usually delivered early and left on the driveway, so Peter walked over to the front door, turned the handle, and stepped outside into the crisp, cool autumn air. He walked down the front steps, picked up the tightly rolled newspaper from the driveway, and turned around to head back inside. But as he pushed against the front door, he realized it wouldn't budge. In his morning haze, he had forgotten that the lock was set to automatically engage when the door closed. He was locked out of his own house. However, this was not a major problem. Like many homeowners, Peter had prepared for this exact scenario. He walked over to the welcome mat lying on the front porch, lifted up one of the corners, and retrieved the spare key he kept hidden underneath. He slipped the key into the deadbolt, turned it, opened the door, and walked back into the warm house. He made sure to step back outside for a brief moment to place the spare key back in its hiding spot under the mat before heading back inside. He sat down at the kitchen table, took a sip of his hot coffee, and spent several minutes quietly reading the morning news. When he was finished, he stood up, carried his empty mug over to the sink, and placed it inside. He then opened the refrigerator, took out some sandwich ingredients, and packed himself a neat lunch inside his black lunchbox, preparing for his daily commute to the courthouse. Peter was a man of absolute punctuality. He hated being late, and his colleagues knew they could always count on him to be at his desk precisely on time. With his lunchbox in hand and his keys in his pocket, Peter walked over to the front door, ready to leave. But as he reached for the handle, his body suddenly went completely limp. He collapsed onto the hardwood floor right in front of the door and died. His body lay there, completely blocking the entryway. Back at the appellate court, the hours began to tick by. 9 o'clock came and went, and Peter's desk remained empty. His colleagues were immediately confused. This was completely unlike Peter. If he was going to be even a few minutes late, he would always call. They tried calling his home phone and his cell phone, but there was no answer. As the morning progressed, their concern turned to genuine worry. The court officials decided to dispatch a court officer to Peter's residence to perform a welfare check and make sure he was okay. When the officer pulled up to the beautiful two-story home in Delmar, he noticed that the family's cars were parked in the driveway. This made Peter's absence even more suspicious. The officer walked up the front steps and knocked loudly on the front door. He waited, but there was only silence. He knocked again, calling out Peter's name, but received no response. He reached out and tried the door handle. To his surprise, the lock was turned and the door was unlocked. He pushed the door open, but it only moved a few inches before hitting something heavy on the floor behind it. The officer leaned forward, peeking his head through the narrow gap, and gasped in horror. Lying on the floor in a massive pool of blood was Peter Porco. His head had been subjected to a devastating, violent attack, and he was clearly deceased. The officer immediately backed out of the house, pulled out his radio, and called for urgent backup and emergency medical services. Within minutes, the peaceful neighborhood was flooded with police cruisers, ambulances, and forensic units. Detectives carefully entered the home, navigating around Peter's body. They began a sweep of the house, moving up the stairs to search for other occupants. When they walked into the master bedroom, they were met with a scene of absolute carnage. Lying in the bed, covered in blood, was 54-year-old Joan Porco. Her face and head had been brutally shattered by a heavy, sharp object. The sheets and walls were stained with blood. But as the paramedics rushed to her side, they realized something truly miraculous. Despite the catastrophic nature of her injuries, Joan was still breathing and had a weak pulse. She was immediately stabilized, carried down the stairs on a stretcher, and rushed to the nearest hospital, where she underwent hours of emergency neurosurgery. Doctors were forced to place her into a medically induced coma to protect her highly damaged brain, and her survival remained highly uncertain. Back at the crime scene, forensic investigators began meticulously searching for clues. They discovered that the home's security alarm system panel, located near the entrance, had been violently smashed and ripped from the wall. Outside, the landline telephone wires had been cleanly cut with a pair of shears. A screen on one of the basement windows had been sliced open, suggesting that the killer had used that window to slip inside undetected. But as the detectives looked closer, they realized this was not a home invasion robbery gone wrong. Peter's wallet, filled with cash, was sitting right where he had left it. Joan's expensive jewelry was still untouched in her drawers. The killer had bypassed valuable electronics and personal belongings. This was a targeted, highly personal attack. During their search of the home, investigators found a heavy fireman's axe hidden inside one of the bedroom closets. The axe was covered in blood, hair, and bone fragments. It belonged to the Porco family, and testing quickly confirmed that it was indeed the weapon used to attack both Peter and Joan. The police immediately sought to contact the couple's two sons to deliver the tragic news. They reached Jonathan, who was out at sea on his Navy submarine, and he was deeply devastated. They also reached out to the University of Rochester to locate 21-year-old Christopher. When Christopher learned that his parents had been found, he placed a phone call to the police department to get more information. In the recorded phone call, Christopher's voice was shockingly flat and calm. He introduced himself, explained that he had been told his parents were found dead, and asked if the police had any details. The officer asked where he was, and Christopher calmly replied that he was at school in Rochester, New York. When the officer told him to drive straight to Albany Medical Center because his mother was still alive, Christopher simply asked what her condition was, stating he hadn't spoken to her yet. For anyone listening to that recording, the lack of emotion in Christopher's voice was deeply chilling. There was no panic, no tears, and no desperation. He sounded as though he was making a routine inquiry. And as detectives began to dig into Christopher's background, they quickly realized why. Christopher was a cold, calculating psychopath, and he was the one who had planned and executed the attack on his own parents. The investigators discovered that Christopher's life was a massive web of lies and financial fraud. He had been failing out of the University of Rochester due to poor attendance and bad grades. To hide his failures from his parents and maintain a lavish lifestyle, he had been forging his father's signature on major financial documents. He had taken out over $31,000 in student loans and lines of credit in Peter's name, using the money to pay his tuition and purchase a bright yellow Jeep Wrangler. When his parents began receiving notices about these mysterious loans, they realized what their son had done. Just days before the attack, Peter had confronted Christopher in a series of tense, emotional emails. Peter told him that his behavior was a betrayal of trust and that he could no longer support him financially if he continued to lie. But Peter also wrote that he loved him, and he begged Christopher to come home so they could figure out a way to resolve the debt together. Instead of facing his parents and taking responsibility, Christopher decided to eliminate them. On the night of Sunday, November 14th, Christopher snuck out of his college dorm in Rochester. He got into his yellow Jeep and drove more than 200 miles east to his parents' home in Delmar. He arrived in the middle of the night, cut the telephone lines from the outside, and slipped through the basement window. He walked over to the alarm panel and smashed it to silence any alert. He then grabbed his father's fireman's axe, walked quietly up the stairs to the master bedroom, and brutally attacked his sleeping parents, striking them repeatedly in the face and head with the heavy weapon. Believing he had killed them both, Christopher hid the bloody axe in a closet, got back into his yellow Jeep, and drove all the way back to Rochester, arriving at his dorm room in the early morning hours to establish an alibi. But while the crime itself was horrific, it was the medical mystery surrounding Peter Porco's final hours that left investigators and medical experts completely stunned. It is one of the most bizarre and haunting phenomena in forensic history. Peter had been struck 16 times in the head with a heavy axe. His skull was fractured in multiple places, and his brain had suffered catastrophic fatal trauma. But because of the specific way the axe had damaged his brain, the pathways that processed pain and conscious awareness had been completely destroyed, while the deeper, primitive structures of his brain remained intact. In his final moments, Peter's conscious mind was completely offline. He did not realize he had been attacked, and he could not feel the physical trauma. Instead, his brain reverted entirely to procedural memory, the deep-seated habits and routines that he had performed every single day for decades. And so, acting entirely on autopilot, Peter Porco simply got out of bed, walked into the bathroom, shaved his face, got dressed in his work clothes, walked downstairs, made coffee, unloaded the dishwasher, got locked out, retrieved the hidden key, read the newspaper, packed his lunch, and only collapsed and died when his body finally ran out of blood at the front door. The image of a man quietly going about his peaceful, ordinary morning chores while suffering from 16 fatal axe wounds to the head is almost impossible to comprehend. It highlights the incredible, terrifying power of human habit and the complexity of the brain. The trial of Christopher Porco began in 2006 and quickly became a national media sensation. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence against Christopher, including security camera footage of his yellow Jeep traveling on the New York State Thruway at the exact times of the crime, DNA evidence, and testimony from his college classmate. But the most shocking aspect of the trial was the behavior of his surviving mother, Joan. Joan had survived the horrific attack, though she lost an eye, a portion of her skull, and was left with severe facial scarring. When she first woke up from her medically induced coma, she had indicated to the detectives, through nods and gestures, that Christopher was the person who had attacked them. However, as the trial approached, Joan suffered from profound memory loss regarding the night of the attack. She completely recanted her initial identification of her son and refused to believe that Christopher could commit such a heinous act. She stood by him unconditionally, raising $250,000 to post his bail and allowing him to live with her in the very house where the murder occurred. Every single day of the trial, Joan walked into the courthouse hand in hand with Christopher, presenting a united front to the jury. She pleaded with the public and the court to find the real killer, insisting that her son was completely innocent. Despite her emotional support, the jury was not convinced. The mountain of physical and circumstantial evidence against Christopher was too great to ignore. After several days of deliberation, the jury found Christopher Porco guilty of second-degree murder and attempted murder. He was sentenced to 50 years to life in prison, ensuring he would spend the majority of his remaining years behind bars. Even after the guilty verdict, Joan Porco refused to abandon her son. She continues to visit him in prison and speaks to him on the phone regularly. It remains one of the most tragic, heart-wrenching, and deeply unsettling stories of maternal devotion in true crime history, leaving a lingering, haunting question about the lengths a mother will go to protect her child, even when that child has committed the ultimate betrayal. Now, let us examine the sheer length and depth of these cases and the profound psychological impacts they had on the surviving family members. When we look back at the case of Pauline Dakin, we see a woman who spent almost her entire life running from shadows that did not exist. The damage inflicted by Stan Sears's deep-seated psychiatric delusion was not physical, but it was incredibly destructive nonetheless. For decades, Pauline was forced to look at her loving father as a monster, an assassin, and a key figure in a violent mafia syndicate. She was denied a relationship with him, and she spent her formative years in a state of hypervigilance, expecting a bullet or poison to end her family's lives at any moment. Her childhood was defined by packing boxes, midnight flights, and forced goodbyes to dear friends. And yet, when the truth was finally revealed, there was no sense of closure or relief. The tragedy of delusion syndrome and folie à deux is that the people trapped inside the illusion cannot simply be reasoned out of it. To Ruth and Stan, the threat was as real as the air they breathed. Confronting them with facts did not shatter the illusion. Instead, it only isolated Pauline further. She was left with a choice: to live in their fabricated paranoid world, or to step out into reality and be viewed by her own mother as a doomed, targets of opportunity casualty who had abandoned her protection. The emotional toll of that isolation is difficult to overstate. Pauline had to mourn the loss of a mother who was still physically alive, knowing that her mother was living in a constant state of terror on her behalf. By writing her book, Pauline was able to take back control of her narrative and share her story with the world, but the scars of her bizarre, shadow-filled childhood would remain with her forever. Similarly, when we look at the Porco case, we are forced to confront the dark depths of human psychology and the absolute limits of maternal love. The tragedy of Peter and Joan Porco is one that shakes us to our core because it took place within the safest sanctuary imaginable, a loving, supportive family home in a quiet, peaceful neighborhood. Peter Porco was a father who, even when faced with his son's massive financial betrayal, responded with a letter of disappointment mixed with profound love and an offer of help. He did not throw his son out or turn him in to the police. He begged him to come home so they could solve the problem together as a family. And in return for that love and grace, Christopher responded with the ultimate act of violence. He did not just kill his father, he attempted to erase his entire family, cutting the phone lines and smashing the security system to ensure no help would arrive as he swung a heavy fireman's axe into his sleeping parents' faces. The physical reality of Peter Porco's final moments is something that will forever haunt the minds of those who investigate this case. The human body is a highly complex machine, and when subjected to such extreme trauma, the brain's ability to compartmentalize and rely on procedural memory is both a miracle and a horror. Peter's subconscious mind, working to protect him from the sheer agonizing reality of his injuries, allowed him to spend his final hour of life in peaceful, mundane routine. He did his chores, made his coffee, and checked his mail, totally unaware that his life was slipping away with every step he took. It is an image of profound, tragic peace in the midst of absolute horror. And yet, the tragedy did not end with Peter's death. It continued in the courtroom, where Joan Porco, scarred, disfigured, and permanently damaged by her son's hand, chose to stand by him anyway. The psychological defense mechanisms required for a mother to look at her child, knowing he is accused of hacking her husband to death and trying to do the same to her, and still hold his hand, are mind-boggling. Whether Joan truly lost her memory of that horrific night, or if her mind simply locked the memory away in a dark, inaccessible vault to protect her from a reality too painful to bear, we will never know. But her continued devotion to Christopher, her regular visits to the maximum security prison, and her refusal to acknowledge his guilt serve as a chilling reminder of the complexity of family bonds. These stories, though vastly different in their details, all share a common thread. They show us how the human mind, when faced with extreme stress, trauma, or psychological disease, can create its own version of reality. Whether it is a tiny fir tree growing in a lung, an elaborate mafia conspiracy born of a shared delusion, or a dying father performing his morning chores on autopilot, the truth is indeed far stranger and often far more tragic than any fiction we could ever write. We are left to ponder the fragility of our own perceptions of reality. We wake up every day assuming that the world around us is exactly as we see it. We trust our senses, our memories, and our loved ones. But as these cases demonstrate, the line between what is real and what we believe to be real can sometimes be incredibly thin, and when that line is crossed, the consequences can be absolutely devastating. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Barbara Rocky, 22, was sitting at her bedroom desk in Provo, Utah on the 11th of March, 1974. She was writing rapidly, almost angrily. She stopped, chewed her pen, and read her writing sometimes. It didn't satisfy her yet. She needed perfect words. She added a few lines, crossed off something, and reread it. Roommates were the recipients of her letter. Since this letter was her goodbye, it had to be perfect. Barbara was a junior at BYU, as everyone called it. BYU was religious. Most pupils were Mormons, but Barbara wasn't. She went to BYU because she was attracted by religion, not to practice it. She felt attending a faith-based school would be fascinating. But when she arrived, she realized her error. She felt absolutely out of place. Her classmates spent hours at church every week. They all observed stringent behavioral rules and principles. That didn't suit Barbara. Barbara, from California, was more free-spirited. She liked exploring new things and wasn't interested in rules. Barbara had been frustrated and alienated at BYU for 3 years. Her classmates didn't understand her, and she didn't either. She hoped her new home would alter things. 2 months earlier, in January, she moved with 7 other girls. It was evident by now that these girls didn't like her more than anyone else. They were pious, like the rest of BYU students, and thought Barbara was crazy. They didn't understand why she dated different individuals or tried different religions. They didn't get it. Barbara opted to lean into it, instead of trying to win her housemates over or change their thoughts about her. She acted out, intentionally making them uncomfortable. She told them she prayed to the devil, knowing they would be shocked. It works. They were stunned. Barbara began to feel that these females weren't as weirded out by her. They were suddenly terrified of her. That left Barbara feeling even more alone. Barbara was composing this letter at her desk for all those reasons. She informed her roommates that she would leave school temporarily. She needed people who understood her. She envisioned a small group of pals surrounding Richard Finder. Richard claimed telepathic powers. Barbara met him when she called a radio show where he gave paranormal readings. Something clicked between them immediately. Although Richard was almost a decade her senior, he appeared to understand Barbara better than anybody else. Since that phone conversation, their relationship was passionate. The atmosphere was beautiful and mystical. However, Richard lived far away, so most of their connection was over the phone. Barbara thought it would be wonderful to be closer to Richard and his open-minded pals. Barbara wanted to leave BYU for another reason, because she felt frightened as a young lady on a college campus. Recent national news headlines about college women being attacked were alarming. In January, a Washington State student was battered and nearly killed in her dorm room. Another campus girl disappeared the next month. Barbara was alarmed even though these attacks did not occur at BYU. It was especially uncomfortable because the targeted women resembled her. They had long, dark hair and similar faces. To protect herself, Barbara started judo courses at school. She even persuaded her best buddy, Jerry Hicker, to help her acquire a rifle for safety. The difficulty was that Barbara had lately lost her gun. She hadn't found it in weeks. She searched her room, car, and more. Although she reported it lost to campus police, she had no idea where it went. Barbara forgot about the lost gun for now. She breathed deeply and finished her goodbye letter. She then looked at her wall clock. Nearly 10 in the morning. She had class. She snatched the letter and put it in her purse. Her purse contained a turquoise necklace. Selling it that day was her plan. She would pawn her most treasured possession to earn seed money to leave town. Her destination would depend on how much money she could get. While packing to leave her room, Barbara heard a car pull into the driveway. I was relieved. She hoped her best buddy Jerry would return her car before class after borrowing it 2 days earlier to go skiing. He seemed to have arrived just in time. Barbara ran out her front door and saw her car, and Jerry leaping out of the driver's seat and waving her keys, shouting, "Hey, I'm back!" Jerry asked Barbara whether they were still going to hang out later that day as he returned the car keys. Barbara was busy. She was thinking about class and selling her necklace. She figured Salt Lake City had more pawn shops and paid higher than Provo. Driving north took less than an hour. After class, she could drive there since Jerry had dropped off her car. Barbara only nodded at Jerry's words, not paying attention. She snatched the keys, got in her car, and drove off. Barbara was still waiting for the teacher to dismiss her social work class over an hour later. She heard some pupils whispering behind her as she seated. she turned red, as they did, even though she couldn't understand them. Even if they weren't talking about her, it wouldn't have been the first. Her name was often mentioned at BYU. Barbara tried to ignore them. After the teacher let them leave, she sprang up, put her books in her bag, and ran out of the building. She swiftly walked to her car, got in, and drove away. She felt excited as she walked down the street toward the freeway. She couldn't wait to sell this necklace and leave. After 3 hours, Barbara's best friend Jerry went up the sidewalk to her house. He believed they would meet that afternoon, but Barbara never showed up. Barbara wouldn't skip plans without contacting. He was at her residence to check on her. Jerry realized her car wasn't in the driveway initially. He stood outside, contemplating whether to go inside and ask her roommates where she was. He decided against it. He knew they disliked him too. Instead, he turned around and returned home. He passed an apartment complex down the street from Barbara's house on his way back, stopping dead in his tracks, because he saw Barbara's automobile in the lot. This was unusual. Jerry was confident she didn't know anyone in that building. Now worried about Barbara, Jerry went to her car to check it out. He looked in through the driver's side window and noticed a message on the passenger seat. He checked the door handle and found the car unlocked. He entered and grabbed the note. He started reading. He noticed his heart rate rise. Jerry ran into campus cops an hour later. Barbara's roommates trailed him. Jerry returned home to show Barbara's roommates the note he found in her car. He wanted to know if they had seen her since he was worried it was a suicide note. It appeared Barbara wrote the parting note. It indicated she was leaving for her people. The tone alarmed him. Jerry knew her roommates felt he was exaggerating. However, they agreed to accompany him to the police station to check on him. When the officer on duty came to the front desk, Jerry told him he had arrangements with Barbara that day and she hadn't shown up, which was unusual. He then detailed how he found her car in that unfamiliar parking lot, this letter, and his doubts about its meaning. The officer on duty said, "Okay, we'll look into it." Campus police did so for several hours. However, Barbara had not been seen or heard from since that morning. They contacted other campus students and her family. Realizing this could be a missing persons case, the police kept investigating. However, it was too soon to call it such. It was preliminary on the first day. The next day, a Utah utility worker hiked up a path in Big Cottonwood Canyon over 50 miles north of BYU, a steep nature preserve outside Salt Lake City. Officially, he was checking water lines, but he was also relaxing and enjoying the surroundings. Beautiful place. In the highlands, it was quiet and remote. When he reached the top of the trail and saw others, he was shocked. The woman was up there, but his brain initially processed what he saw as a woman lying on the ground, possibly nude. He initially thought, oh, she's sunbathing. That's what she's doing up here. But then he looked closer. He noticed March. It's cold. And she's face down. She is completely naked. He took a couple more steps forward and his brain finally understood what he saw. He gasped, turned around, and fled as fast as he could to his car to call the police. Captain Pete Hayward of the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office drove his cruiser into Big Cottonwood Canyon via a remote access road within an hour. Hayward usually enjoyed nature. He spent his free time hunting and fishing. The lovely scenery and remote location were actually an annoyance right now. He needed to reach his objective quickly, but it was hard out here. Hayward had received a call about a utility worker finding a woman deceased in the canyon. A few first responders were already protecting the site, but Hayward knew they couldn't do much until he arrived. Because every murder case detail has to go via him. A few minutes later, Hayward observed police cruisers and a deputy at a trailhead ahead. He stopped, got out of his car, and followed the deputy up a steep trail for 300 yards. He was exhausted when he observed additional crime scene techs and officers around a bush. The body of a naked woman lay face down under the bush. Hayward approached and crouched over the body. He saw at least 3 bullet wounds in the woman's back immediately. No other injuries or decomposition were visible. He estimated that this woman had been here for a day, which was a miracle. Nobody visited this region this time of year. Without the utility worker, she may have gone missing for months. Hayward spotted the woman's clothes and shoes next to the body. Each item was nicely folded, which surprised him. Hayward donned latex gloves and examined the outfit. Nothing was ripped or destroyed, he saw. Hayward also remarked that the scene was as immaculate as the garments as he strolled about. No firearms was visible. No dirt marks indicated a struggle or brawl. The body showed no signs of being dragged. Hayward believed this woman was shot and died where she was found. Hayward surveyed the trail from the middle. Those nicely folded clothing could signify several things. A consenting intercourse that went violent may have erased them. The woman may have been gunned down. Hayward felt this woman's killer was someone she knew. Because getting here from the road was hard. Hayward was approaching 50 and wasn't in great shape, but even a young and fit person would struggle to force another up a steep slope like this. It made more logical that she had walked up here freely with a trusted person. After they got up here, that individual killed her without witnesses. Hayward believed his theory wasn't much until he identified this woman. It appeared she had no handbag and no ID in her folded clothes. Hayward signaled other police to help him flip her body to see below. Hayward noticed a few bullets on the dirt as they did it. The rear images showed they had gone straight through her. Hayward directed his team to photograph and bag the rounds for testing immediately. He also directed them to get some of the ground where the bullets were lodged in case it contained more evidence. In the 1970s, investigators could test garment fibers or hairs for a suspect without DNA. After giving his crew directions, Hayward breathed deeply and returned down the trail. He had to find her name. Next Wednesday, March 13, Hayward hurried down a Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office hallway to a meeting room. He was bleary-eyed and adrenaline-fueled after working this case constantly since the day before. He had just met with the ballistics expert who told him the gun that killed this woman was likely .357 caliber. Of course, this was useful for the investigation. Since .357s were plentiful, it didn't narrow things down. Hayward found something else important for the investigation. Victim's identity. Barbara Rocky was 22. Hayward's team aired the body's finding on local news the night before. After releasing that, BYU police called regarding a student who had gone missing a day earlier. Some of this missing student's friends had come to Salt Lake City to identify the deceased a few hours earlier and confirmed that it was Barbara. Hayward had previously spoken to some of the youngsters and had other officers contact Barbara's relatives. But Hayward was on his way to receive a formal statement from a young guy called Jerry Hicker. Jerry was one of the body's identifiers and reported Barbara missing initially. Hayward hoped he might help them find Barbara's killer. Hayward sat across from Jerry at a conference table minutes later. Jerry appeared rattled. He kept shaking his head and turning away, like he was trying not to cry. Hayward was a harsh interrogator. Given Jerry's clear guilt, he didn't spend time giving condolences or Kleenex. According to Barbara, he was her best school friend. Hayward believed Barbara was murdered by a trusted person. So he plainly told Jerry that he needed to know everything that transpired the day Barbara disappeared. Jerry was surprised by the bluntness. However, he took a hesitant breath and claimed that he had taken Barbara's automobile the day before and returned it at her house around 10 a.m. on Monday. He then said he spent several hours in the library. He said he'd meet Barbara. Barbara didn't show up for their later-day hangout. He found her car gone when he checked on her at home. He started walking home again when he saw her car down the block, parked outside an apartment complex he didn't understand. His assumption was that she didn't know anyone there. He stated he was walking to the car and spotted a message inside. Doorknob was open when he tried. He took the note from within and read it. He stated the note was unsettling. He suspected a suicide note. Hayward nods. He noticed the note. BYU police gave it to him. Excerpt, Barbara seemed to be informing her housemates she was leaving town to be with like-minded people. The note was cryptic, so Hayward wasn't sure what to make of it. A suicide note or a regular note could be it. He wasn't even convinced Barbara wrote the letter. Her killer may have authored the letter. Barbara's murderer may have tried to make her absence look like a suicide or a runaway in hopes that police would never uncover her body. Hayward forwarded the letter to a handwriting expert for feedback. Hayward asked Jerry about Barbara. Jerry claimed that they hung out a lot and that she gravitated toward him because she felt unwelcome at school and with her housemates, who didn't like her since she wasn't religious. Jerry also told Hayward that Barbara had exacerbated her roommates' disagreement by shouting sacrilegious things to frighten them. He said there was so much tension between them that he tried to find Barbara a new place to live. This cheered Hayward. The possibility of Barbara's domestic struggle seemed intriguing. Even though a group of young, devout Mormon ladies were unlikely murder suspects, it was worth investigating. One of them may have snapped and tried to injure Barbara after being scared by her mocking. Hayward stood up and informed Jerry he could leave because he had no more questions. He wasn't ready to rule out anyone, but Jerry seemed doubtful. He reported Barbara missing and had an alibi for sections of the day. Given that her body was recovered in a remote region by chance, the killer would have been better off keeping quiet and hoping it was never found. Why would Jerry call the police if he was the killer? It was illogical. Hayward left to hassle officers. They needed to speak with Barbara's roommates in Provo. 2 days after Barbara's death was located in the canyon, Hayward drove to a Salt Lake City pawn shop the next afternoon. Because so much had transpired in the last 24 hours, he was exhausted even more than yesterday. They contacted Barbara's relatives, who were upset, but they had no useful information for the investigation. They didn't know Barbara's friends or school life, so they couldn't say if somebody wanted to hurt her. No one knew if she planned to leave campus. Apparently, she was, since the handwriting expert returned to verify the note. Written by Barbara. If read literally, the note was about her true plans to depart. Hayward thought the letter from Barbara should be interpreted literally after speaking to Jerry, who had talked about the tension between Barbara and her roommates and how she didn't fit in, and after speaking to all 7 of Barbara's roommates, who all admitted they didn't like Barbara. She only wanted to leave university and her roommates. But the roommates had good explanations for Barbara's disappearance. Hayward had to eliminate the housemates for now. Hayward was unconcerned since the roommates had given him another lead. One roommate said Barbara wanted to pawn her Salt Lake City turquoise necklace before she left. Hayward and other cops spent the day searching local pawn shops to discover if she had done it. Hayward hadn't located the necklace or Barbara's pawn store yet. But aside from this jewelry lead, the investigation was losing pace, so he felt hopeful, maybe too hopeful. They had searched and fingerprinted Barbara's car, but discovered nothing substantial. The returned autopsy was basically useless. The medical examiner found 5 gunshot wounds, more than Hayward expected. But they couldn't confirm Barbara's sexual assault. The forensics analysis showed no fingerprints from the crime scene. Hayward entered this pawn store with all of this in his brain. He asked the cashier if she bought a turquoise necklace. To Hayward's surprise, the woman answered, yes. She then pointed to a glass case behind the counter where a long white necklace with turquoise stones was sitting on a red felt pad. After 30 minutes, Hayward was back in his cruiser, his heart racing and his mind running so quickly he couldn't focus. Because Hayward finally had a trail. Barbara fit the shop clerk's description of the turquoise necklace seller. Additionally, the shopkeeper had a sale ticket showing Barbara was at the store on March 11th at 12:50 p.m., the day she disappeared. The most amazing part of this fresh lead was that Barbara informed this clerk she was in a hurry because her lover was circling the block outside. This was significant because Hayward and his crew had interviewed many people in Barbara's life, and none had indicated a lover. Unfortunately, the pawnshop worker had not seen Barbara's boyfriend. After taking the necklace and receipt as evidence, Hayward rushed back to the precinct to make calls. He wanted to know if Barbara's friends knew about this boyfriend, but hadn't said it. A deputy stopped Hayward when he parked his car and ran into the precinct. The deputy seemed as excited and stressed as Hayward. The deputy told Hayward he wouldn't believe this, but they were continuing their background interviews, and Barbara's acquaintances indicated she had mentioned Richard, her lover. This was excellent for Hayward. Exactly this information was his goal. The deputy was upset because she had a boyfriend, not this. He said Richard was Richard Finder, a California psychic who was in town on a ski holiday when Barbara was killed. They knew that because Richard had called the station unexpectedly to offer help. A few hours later, Hayward sat across from 30-year-old Richard Finder in interrogation. Richard, with spectacles and a goatee, appeared confident and eager to help. Hayward felt like he was acting. He believed Richard killed Barbara. After all, murderers often entered murder investigations to see what was going on and divert culpability. Hayward believed Richard was ringing in to offer his psychic skills. Hayward had spent the last 2 hours investigating Richard. He also found his .357 pistol, which killed Barbara. He also discovered that Richard was staying in Salt Lake City near Barbara's body in Big Cottonwood Canyon. Way too many coincidences. Hayward was ready to be brutal with Richard to get a confession. But Hayward answered some background questions first. Richard revealed that Barbara met him after hearing him on the radio. He said they'd never been physical but had a profound spiritual relationship. After that, Hayward directly asked Richard why he contacted the station. Richard became serious and stated he needed to come forward because he had a sense about Barbara's fate. He said he was a psychic and had a vision that the murder weapon was tossed in water. Hayward couldn't believe his ears. Since the cops hadn't reported the murder weapon missing, he knew they were hunting for the murder weapon, but Richard shouldn't have. Thus, Hayward did not inquire further regarding his vision. Instead, he asked that Richard account for every hour of his day on March 11, Barbara's disappearance. Richard seemed truly confused for the first time. He glanced at Hayward in disbelief. Afterward, he denied killing Barbara. "Not possible," he said. He spent all day with buddies. Hayward frowned at Richard and handed him a pad of paper to write down his friend's information for follow-up. As he watched Richard quickly write down names and numbers, Hayward knew this was their guy. The circumstantial evidence against him was overwhelming. He understood they needed more evidence to arrest. Thus, Hayward would first verify Richard's alibi and then test his .357 against Barbara's murder bullets. So he informed Richard he could go for now, but they needed to check his gun. A few weeks later, Hayward sat at his sheriff's office desk staring at Richard's gun ballistics. Barbara was slain by something other than a gun. Hayward couldn't recall being more startled and disappointed. He identified Richard as the killer. Richard, his sole suspect, was great. After checking his alibi, it didn't hold up. His pals answered, "Well, we were with him, but not the whole day. So Richard was missing for major parts of the day she went missing." Hayward grumbled and reminded himself that Richard wasn't innocent just because his gun wasn't a match. It's conceivable he used another .357 and then abandoned it. However, Hayward couldn't believe they were starting over. Having done what he could, he felt done. He spoke to necessary parties. After analyzing their proof, he had nothing. Hayward had experience resolving cases and satisfying families. Now he worried he couldn't do it for the Rocky family. Hayward continued investigating this case for months and years, but the leads dwindled. Finally, he was promoted. He soon got involved in additional cases. Finally, Barbara's case stalled. 3 decades after Barbara's death, Salt Lake City Sheriff's Department Detective Todd Park sat on the floor behind his desk in the fall of 2005. Crime scene images, interview transcripts, and evidence logs from Barbara Rocky's 1,974 murder investigation filled his floor. Park, a new homicide detective, took up this case after Barbara's sister called to ask the sheriff's office to reopen it. Park wasn't sure if it was new guy enthusiasm, but he was preoccupied with solving it. He wanted to discover answers for the Rocky family, who had been wondering about Barbara for over 2 decades. Park seemed really optimistic. Even if they hadn't used DNA testing in the first investigation, they couldn't conduct it then. However, the detectives had done a rape kit and carefully stored all the evidence, including Barbara's clothes and the soil under her body. With DNA technology breakthroughs, they could probably address this. Park had sent several evidence locker items to the lab for testing. He reviewed the case data to gain a sense of how it was probed in 1974 while waiting for the results. He found a peculiar case. The murder was initially suspected as being personal. Police considered the possibility that Ted Bundy killed Barbara even though the case was cold. That this wasn't personal and she was one of his many victims. In 1975, 1 year after Barbara's death, Ted Bundy was caught less than an hour from her Salt Lake City home. He had been killing college women across the West Coast, including several in Utah the year Barbara was killed. In the late 1970s, investigators ruled Ted Bundy out since he was conducting a different murder in Washington state at the same time Barbara was killed. Barbara could have been slain by another local serial killer. Because of the number of U.S. killers in 1974, it was called the Year of Fear. Park eventually agreed with the first investigator that Barbara's murder was personal after reading the notes. Even the amount of times Barbara was shot looked emotional. Park thought Barbara's boyfriend, Richard Finder, was the killer. After all, Richard was nearby during the murder. His alibi was non-existent. He mentioned the missing murder weapon while the public didn't know. Thus, he learned inappropriate crime scene details. Park thought some people, including Barbara's best friend, Jerry Hicker, deserved a second look. He had an alibi, and Barbara had told the pawnshop owner before she was killed that she was with her boyfriend, not Jerry. If Park was right about this being an emotional crime, Jerry had to be considered. He was Barbara's best buddy in school, so maybe he was furious when she left town. Next, Barbara's housemates. They all had good explanations, but one may have hired someone to assassinate Barbara. Park was aware that the original detectives hadn't discovered any proof, but they hadn't spent much time with the roommates either. They promptly disqualified them. Park also realized it could be someone they hadn't considered, like the utility guy who found the body, or a BYU student who didn't like Barbara and thought she was eccentric. Park wasn't sure, but he was confident they'd find DNA in all that old evidence. They'd discover their killer, then. 2 years later, Park paced his office on an October 2007 afternoon. He occasionally glanced at his desk phone. Each minute he waited for a lab call increased his anxiety. Park's reinvestigation of Barbara's murder had reached a dead end with DNA testing. Over 2 years, the medical lab examined practically every item from Barbara's case, including her rape kit swabs and clothes. They couldn't acquire DNA from anything. It either didn't exist or was too old and poorly preserved. Nothing was left to test but the dirt the original investigators retrieved from Barbara's body. Park first didn't send in the dirt because he didn't think it had DNA. He now had only this evidence. When the lab called this time, Park knew he'd either learn the killer's name or his case would be ended. Eventually, Park's phone rang. He grabbed it and got a dry mouth as he heard the lab on the other end. Before Park asked, they told him they had a profile. That dirt sample from Barbara's body included DNA years earlier. Park found a name by running that DNA profile through their criminal database. Reconstructed from DNA evidence and decades of investigation, this is what police believe happened to Barbara Rocky on the 11th of March, 1974. The killer saw Barbara's car come up to the sidewalk before noon. The killer jumped inside and smiled at Barbara, who smiled back. As Barbara requested, they drove to the Salt Lake City pawn store. When they arrived, Barbara stepped out of the car and entered. After she entered, the killer took the driver's seat. They would drive the car from then on. Their heart raced as the killer waited for Barbara in the driver's seat. They couldn't wait for her to return outside and get in the car because the killer loved her. They decided to make their connection physical today. When Barbara returned outside and jumped into the passenger seat after selling her jewelry, the killer joyfully stated, "Hey, there's some trails nearby. Why don't we go for a hike?" Barbara paused, like she didn't want to do this. But the killer knew Barbara was leaving Utah. They knew she wrote a goodbye note and sold the necklace to go permanently. They guilt-tripped her. They said, "Look, Let's just go enjoy the beautiful countryside before you leave town." Barbara shrugged and said, "Okay, fine." The killer joyfully went to the canyon and parked near a picnic area. Then they stepped out and started walking toward a trail, and the killer touched the outside of their pocket to make sure the gun they stole from Barbara was still there. They didn't know if they'd use the gun, but they wanted to make sure it was ready. While hiking this trail, the killer and Barbara chatted, made their way up, and enjoyed the sights. But eventually, the killer couldn't wait. They had to act. They stopped Barbara. The killer stepped forward and made their move after checking for others. Their touch on Barbara was plainly amorous. However, Barbara recoiled and stepped back, telling the killer she didn't want it. This enraged the killer immediately. The killer approached her again and saw Barbara's terrified expression, which made them even angrier. After aiming Barbara's gun at her, they urged her to take off her clothes. Barbara was shocked, but she obeyed. She deliberately took her time. She carefully folded each garment while pleading with the killer not to do so. She pleaded with the killer after taking off her clothing and stacking them close to her. Though ashamed and outraged, the killer decided enough was enough. Barbara was shot in the chest. She collapsed. They fired more recklessly until Barbara stopped. The killer panicked and rushed down the trail to Barbara's car once Barbara was dead or dying. They got in and went to Provo and BYU. However, they stopped and left Barbara's pocketbook and revolver. When they arrived in Provo, they parked Barbara's car down the road near that other apartment complex so the killer wouldn't see them. They fled, leaving Barbara's message in the car. Barbara's note were not suicide notes. Her parting note to her roommates was literal. However, the killer thought it was a suicide letter. If they left it there, when they returned and found the letter in the car, they could inform the police Barbara may have killed herself. Hopefully, it would steer the cops away from the killer. Jerry Hicker, Barbara's best friend, killed her. Jerry's cooperation and fact that he reported her missing led the first detectives to not suspect him. After he admitted to violence, they were suspicious. He was involved in other university rapes the year after killing Barbara. They didn't have enough evidence to arrest until decades later when the lab recovered DNA in 1974 crime scene dirt. They matched that profile to Jerry's DNA from another unrelated incident. Jerry killed Barbara with her gun, which he helped her buy to defend herself from killers like him. Jerry was dying of cancer when arrested in 2007. He confessed to Barbara's murder for a lesser sentence and served 5 years. His death occurred in 2014. Many thanks for viewing. Comment your thoughts about today's episode. And remember, you can binge on our true crime playlist right now. Till next time. See you. Think about the choices you make every single day. Most of them feel completely minor. You choose what to eat for breakfast, which route to take to work, or whether to say hello to a stranger. You do not spend hours agonizing over these decisions because they seem totally harmless. But life has a very strange way of working. Sometimes, the smallest, most insignificant choice you make can set off a massive chain reaction. A single moment can ripple outward and completely reshape your entire future, or even the lives of millions of other people around the globe. Today, we are going to look at 3 incredible stories of real people who made simple choices that led to some of the most famous, unexpected turning points in modern history. And as you will see, none of them could have possibly guessed where their actions would lead. Our first story begins on a cold morning on the 17th of January, 1977. A 36-year-old man named Gary Gilmore was walking slowly across a yard towards an old abandoned canned food factory in Draper, Utah. He was not alone. In fact, Gary was surrounded by several heavily armed prison guards. The guards were tense. They kept their hands close to their weapons because they were terrified that Gary might try to make a run for it. They thought he might break away and force them to shoot him right there in the yard. But the truth was, Gary had absolutely no intention of running. He had been waiting for this exact moment for months, and he was completely ready. So Gary kept walking, his boots crunching on the cold ground flanked by the guards. He did not hesitate for a single second when they reached the entrance of the concrete building. He just stepped inside. The interior of the old factory was massive, cold, and completely empty. There was no machinery left, no boxes, nothing. It was just a giant, cavernous space with concrete floors and high ceilings. But way across the room, pushed up against the far back wall, sat a single wooden chair. Gary did not need to be told what to do. He immediately began walking across the empty concrete floor directly toward that chair. When he reached it, he turned around and sat down. As soon as he was seated, the guards moved in quickly. They took thick leather straps and began securing his wrists and his ankles to the wooden chair so he could not move at all. Throughout this entire process, Gary did not struggle. He did not say a word. He did not even look at the guards. Instead, his eyes were locked on the opposite side of the empty room. On the far wall, directly across from where Gary was strapped down, was a large, heavy black curtain. It looked like someone had wheeled out a stage curtain to block the view of whatever was behind it. And as Gary stared at this curtain, he noticed there were 5 small, evenly spaced slots cut into the fabric. Gary could not see through those dark slots, but he knew exactly what was behind them. He knew that at each of those 5 stations, a police officer was standing with a loaded rifle. They were the firing squad, and they were there because Gary himself had specifically requested them. To understand how Gary ended up in this chair, we have to go back to the summer of 1976. Gary was a troubled man who had spent most of his adult life in and out of reform schools and prisons for various crimes. But in July of 1976, his behavior turned incredibly violent. Over the course of just 2 days, Gary robbed and murdered 2 innocent young men in Utah. First, he shot Max Jensen, a gas station attendant who complied with all of his demands. The very next night, he shot Benny Bushnell, a student working at a motel. Both men did exactly what Gary asked, but he killed them anyway. Gary was caught almost immediately, put on trial, and convicted of murder. In October of 1976, the jury sentenced him to death. Now, at the time, this was a massive deal. The United States had not executed anyone in nearly 10 years due to a Supreme Court ruling on the death penalty. Gary's case was going to be the first execution in a decade, and it sparked a huge media storm. Almost immediately, people stepped in to try and stop it. Gary's own mother, along with organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union, filed multiple appeals to try and get his sentence changed to life in prison. But while most death row inmates would have been grateful for the help, Gary was furious. He did not want to spend the rest of his life locked in a concrete box. He believed that life without parole was a fate far worse than death. And so, Gary fought against his own lawyers. He pushed the courts to go ahead with the execution as quickly as possible. Under Utah law at the time, death row inmates were allowed to choose how they wanted to die. They could choose hanging, or they could choose a firing squad. Gary chose the firing squad. And so, after months of legal battles, his request was finally granted. Now, back in the abandoned cannery, the guards finished tightening the leather straps on Gary's wrists and ankles. They stepped away, leaving him alone in the chair. Then, a prison chaplain walked over. He stood beside Gary and read him his last rites. When he finished, the chaplain looked down at Gary and asked him if he had any final words he wanted to share with the world. Gary did not hesitate. He looked up at the chaplain, completely calm, and simply said, "Let's do it." The chaplain nodded, stepped back, and signaled to the men behind the curtain. 5 rifle barrels poked through these small slots in the black fabric. A moment later, a loud blast echoed through the cavernous room, and Gary Gilmore was dead. At this point, you might be wondering how this dark story has anything to do with a small choice changing the world. Well, we have to fast forward 10 years to the year 1987. In Portland, Oregon, a young marketing executive named Dan Whedon was sitting in a conference room at his advertising agency, Whedon and Kennedy. Dan and his team had recently signed a new client. It was a sports shoe company that had a lot of potential, but they were struggling. They were trying desperately to compete with Reebok, which was absolutely dominating the fitness market at the time. This shoe company had hired Dan to create a massive breakthrough marketing campaign that would help them stand out and become a household name. But the problem was Dan and his team were completely stuck. For hours, they sat in that meeting room, tossing around different ideas and pitches. They wanted something that would connect with serious, hardcore athletes, but also with ordinary people who were just trying to get off the couch and go for a jog. Every idea they came up with felt flat. Nothing had that punch they needed. Dan was getting more and more frustrated as the hours ticked by. And then, completely out of nowhere, Dan had a sudden epiphany. He was not even sure why the thought entered his mind, but he suddenly found himself thinking about the execution of Gary Gilmore from 10 years earlier. Like millions of other Americans, Dan had watched the news coverage of the execution back in 1977. And for some strange reason, as he sat in that frustrating meeting, he remembered the very last words Gary had spoken right before the rifles fired. Dan thought about the phrase, "Let's do it." It was incredibly simple. It was direct, and it possessed a strange, rugged determination. It was about taking action without overthinking, without making excuses. But Dan thought the phrase could be just a little bit stronger. He decided to tweak it slightly to make it sound more universal. He changed the word "let's" to the word "just." And so, the phrase became, "Just do it." Dan pitched the three-word slogan to his client, which was Nike. At first, the executives at Nike actually hated it. Phil Knight, the co-founder of the company, thought it was a terrible idea and a waste of money. But Dan convinced them to trust his instinct and run with it. In 1988, Nike launched their first commercial featuring the new slogan showing an 80-year-old man running across the Golden Gate Bridge. The campaign was an overnight sensation. The slogan resonated deeply with people all over the world. Within just a few years, Nike's sales skyrocketed, doubling their business and turning them into the multi-billion-dollar global empire they are today. All because a creative director in Oregon randomly remembered the final words of a convicted killer facing a firing squad. Our second story takes us to the city of London in the year 2009. A 23-year-old aspiring actor named Chris was walking down a busy street on his way to a date. Chris was incredibly stressed out. He had very little money in his bank account, and he was struggling to pay his rent. He desperately needed a big break, and he was hoping that his luck was about to change because the very next morning he had an incredibly important job interview. But for tonight, Chris had to focus on his date. He wanted to make a good impression, but his empty wallet made things very difficult. He could not afford a fancy restaurant or a nice bar. And so, as they walked through the chilly London air, Chris made a choice. He decided to take his date into a local McDonald's. Now, this McDonald's was not a romantic spot. It was extremely loud, the floors were sticky, and it was absolutely packed with people who had been out drinking. But it was the only thing Chris could afford. He looked at his date, feeling a bit embarrassed, and asked if this was okay. She was incredibly understanding. She just smiled, told him it was perfectly fine, and they got in line to order. After they got their food, they turned around to find a place to sit. But the restaurant was so crowded that every single table was completely full. Chris and his date began walking through the dining area, looking for any open spot. Finally, Chris spotted a table where a single man was sitting by himself. The man was quiet, minding his own business, and eating his meal. Crucially, there were 2 empty chairs at his table. Chris walked over, trying to be as polite as possible, and asked the man if they could sit in the empty chairs. He promised they would not bother him and would leave as soon as they finished eating. The man looked up, shrugged, and told them to go ahead. Chris and his date sat down, and they began to eat and talk. But the problem was, Chris was incredibly distracted. His mind kept drifting to the massive job interview he had scheduled for the next morning. He was so anxious about it that he was barely paying attention to the conversation. He just wanted to finish his food, walk his date home, and go to bed so he could be fully rested and focused for the interview. As Chris sat there lost in his thoughts, he suddenly realized that the atmosphere at the table had completely changed. The man sitting across from them had stopped eating. He had turned his head and was now staring directly at Chris's date. The look on his face was not friendly at all. It was aggressive and intensely uncomfortable. Before Chris could even ask what was going on, the stranger opened his mouth and began hurling incredibly cruel insults at Chris's date. He started making fun of the way she looked and the way she talked. Chris was stunned. He looked at his date, then back at the man, trying to understand why this stranger was suddenly attacking them out of nowhere. But the man did not stop. He looked directly at the young woman and called her an ugly pig. Now, Chris had never been in a physical fight in his entire life. He was a gentle guy, and he hated violence. On top of that, Chris was not a particularly large man. He stood at about 5 feet, 8 inches tall. But hearing this stranger brutally insult his date was more than he could take. He decided he had to stand up for her. Chris stood up from his chair, looked at the man, and told him to get up. But as soon as the stranger stood up, Chris realized he had made a massive mistake. The man was an absolute giant. He towered over Chris, blocking out the bright fluorescent lights of the restaurant. But Chris knew he could not back down now. He took a deep breath, wound up his fist, and punched the giant man right in the face. It did not go well. The punch barely registered, and the massive stranger immediately proceeded to beat the living crap out of Chris right there in the middle of the crowded McDonald's. He threw Chris to the ground, hitting him repeatedly while the other customers watched in shock. By the time the giant finally stopped and wandered out of the restaurant into the night, Chris was bruised, bleeding, and utterly humiliated. Chris and his date left the restaurant immediately. Chris kept apologizing over and over again, feeling like a complete failure. His date tried to reassure him, but they were both incredibly shaken up. They went their separate ways, and Chris went home, crawling into bed with his body aching. The next morning, Chris woke up early. He walked into his bathroom, looked in the mirror, and gasped. His face was a total mess. He had a massive, swollen black eye, and his jaw was deeply bruised. He looked like he had just escaped a war zone. Chris felt a wave of pure panic. He was supposed to walk into a high-end professional job interview in just a couple of hours. He wondered if he should just call and cancel. How could anyone take him seriously when he looked like a street brawler? But Chris knew this was the biggest opportunity of his career. He decided he could not let his fear ruin his chances. He put on his best suit, walked out the door, and headed to the interview. When he arrived at the office, he was escorted into a room with the interviewers. As soon as he walked in, he could feel their eyes lock onto his massive black eye. It was incredibly awkward. Nobody asked him about it, and Chris did not want to explain that he had gotten beaten up at a McDonald's the night before. He just tried to remain confident, deliver his lines, and ignore the physical pain in his face. By the end of the meeting, Chris was convinced he had completely blown it. He thanked them for their time and left the building, assuming he would never hear from them again. But a few days later, Chris received a phone call that would change his life forever. It turned out that the interviewers did not hate his black eye at all. In fact, they absolutely loved it. You see, the job Chris was interviewing for was not an office job. It was an audition for a starring role in a massive new fantasy television series. The character they were casting was a gritty, battle-hardened young warrior who constantly found himself in dangerous, violent situations. When Chris had walked into the room looking like he had just been in a real fistfight, the casting directors realized they did not need to use makeup to make him look tough. He looked completely authentic, rugged, and real. They offered Chris the role on the spot. That television show was Game of Thrones, and Chris was cast as the legendary character Jon Snow. Today, the world knows him by his stage name, Kit Harington. He went from being a broke, young actor who could barely afford a cheap meal to a global superstar nominated for multiple Emmy and Globe Awards. All because he made the brave, impulsive choice to stand up to a giant in a London McDonald's. Our third story takes us back to the year 1925, to the campus of Dartmouth College in New Hampshire. A 21-year-old college senior named Ted was sitting inside his dorm room surrounded by his closest friends. The group had managed to get their hands on a bottle of gin, and they were busy pouring drinks and celebrating. Now, to understand the gravity of this situation, we have to remember the time period. In 1925, the United States was in the middle of Prohibition. The law made the manufacture and consumption of alcohol completely illegal. It did not matter that they were 21 years old. Having that bottle of gin in their dorm room was a serious crime that could result in arrest. But Ted was willing to take the risk because he had so much to celebrate. He was a brilliant senior who was about to graduate with high honors. More importantly, he had just been named the editor-in-chief of Dartmouth's humor magazine, The Jack-O-Lantern. For Ted, this was a massive deal. He had dreams of becoming a professional writer and cartoonist. Being the editor was the perfect stepping stone to a successful career. So, feeling incredibly happy and successful, Ted took a drink and passed the bottle around. But as the night went on and they got louder, they suddenly heard a loud knock on the door. The room went silent. Ted got up, opened the door, and his heart sank. Standing in the hallway were two police officers and the college dean. Ted and his friends were caught red-handed. Fortunately, the police decided not to press criminal charges, so nobody went to jail. The school also decided not to expel Ted or his friends, allowing them to graduate. But the school still handed down a severe punishment. Dartmouth stripped Ted of his academic honors and forced him to step down from his position as editor-in-chief of the Jack-O-Lantern. To make matters worse, the dean decreed that he was completely banned from submitting any writing or drawings to the magazine. Ted was devastated. Losing the position felt like his entire future was being ripped away. He spent days in his room wondering how he would ever get his career off the ground if he could not even publish his work in a college paper. At first, Ted thought about pleading with the dean to lift the ban. But he knew the administration was incredibly strict, and they were definitely not going to change their minds. He was completely stuck. But then, Ted had a brilliant idea. He realized that while he was banned from submitting work under his own name, the magazine's staff still accepted submissions from the general public. They did not always verify the identity of the people sending in cartoons. So, Ted made a clever choice. He decided to create a secret identity, a pen name. He drew a series of new cartoons and signed them with a completely different name. He decided to use his middle name, which was his mother's maiden name. The name he chose was Seuss. Ted quietly submitted his drawings to the magazine under his new pseudonym. The new editorial staff at the Jack-O-Lantern had absolutely no idea that the submissions were coming from the banned former editor. They looked at the drawings, fell in love with the unique, whimsical art style, and immediately published them. Ted was thrilled. Not only was he able to keep doing what he loved, but he actually found a strange sense of freedom in writing and drawing under a fake name. It allowed him to be more creative and playful than ever before. He kept up the ruse for the rest of his senior year, graduating without the school ever finding out. And after graduation, when Ted decided to pursue writing and illustrating full-time, he chose to keep using that very same pen name. He added the prefix Doctor to the beginning of it, partly as a joke because his father had always wanted him to go to medical school and become a doctor. Over the course of his long and legendary career, Ted would write and illustrate over 60 books under his famous pen name. His stories would capture the imaginations of hundreds of millions of children and adults all over the world, teaching generations of kids how to read and winning him a Pulitzer Prize. Ted's full name was Theodore Geisel, but the entire world knows him simply as Dr. Seuss. All because a college senior decided to share a bottle of gin with his friends on a quiet night in 1925, got caught, and had to find a creative way to beat the system. It is truly mind-blowing to think about how these lives were fully reshaped by moments that seemed so small. A desperate man facing a firing squad speaks 3 words that become the face of a giant sports empire. A young actor gets into a violent restaurant fight and walks away with the role of a legendary hero. A college kid gets caught with a bottle of illegal gin and ends up creating a famous pen name. We are all always just one small, unexpected choice away from a completely different destiny. Did these stories make you realize how one small decision can change everything? Or are you ready for what comes next? As usual, 6-year-old Yoshika Yasutake dusts a piano in her family's small, clean Helmsley home on the 15th of April, 2018. Yoshika lifted the piano lid and dusted each key after dusting the outside. However, she was careful not to press any keys accidentally and make a sound. She wanted to avoid that. Yoshika always dreaded going to the piano when she cleaned the house because she was afraid of making a sound. Yoshika lowered the piano lid after dusting it inside and out, then dusting each book in a bookcase next to a window. As she did, she heard birds chirping, cars driving, and people talking out the window. After hearing this, Yoshika stopped dusting and looked out the window at the beautiful town. All the roadside stone cottages were glowing in spring sun. Yoshika felt sad about all the things she was missing as she looked out and listened to her village. Yoshika was a world-class pianist. She played packed symphony halls after studying at London's Royal College of Music. Sometimes royal family members were in the audience. She was huge. Yoshika stopped playing the piano after her younger sister Rina returned home. Yoshika became angry when she thought of Rina and turned to stare at her closed bedroom door. Just briefly, Yoshika wished Rina hadn't come home. Because since Rina came home, Yoshika's family seemed to have prioritized nothing else. Only Rina mattered. Yoshika, Rina, and Takahiro, their 51-year-old brother, comprised the Yasutake family. The 80-year-old mother of the three siblings lived with them. Their father died several years earlier. Yoshika and Takahiro were impressive in different ways. Both Yoshika and Takahiro were great pianists and writers. But Rina was better. Rina could speak Greek, Latin, English, Japanese, and her own dialect with a grammar system. Rina was an amazing artist, and everyone wanted her paintings. Rina refused to sell. Maybe she did, but rarely. But that only hyped her art. Getting a Rina painting was so valuable. Rina received scholarships to prestigious private schools as a child, and after graduating high school, she received a full-ride scholarship to Cambridge, one of the world's top universities. Everyone thought Rina would become a world-famous artist. There was something dark inside Rina that no one could identify. Only when she had sudden outbursts of anger did people see this side of her that didn't fit with the rest of her. These anger outbursts were brief, so people dismissed them as a sign of extreme genius. Her brain sometimes couldn't handle how smart she was, and she got mad and frustrated. Rina was completely different when she returned home after graduating from Cambridge. It was like something inside her broke and stayed broken. Rina, had a sudden outburst of anger 2 days after returning home. Rina's rage persisted. After days of rage, her family asked her what was wrong. However, Rina refused to discuss it. Rina eventually locked herself in her family home bedroom and refused to speak to her family for weeks. Rina was different when she emerged after several weeks. She rarely spoke to family members unless necessary. She rarely left the house or her room unless necessary. This was not Rina's post-college phase. It became Rina's life. She stayed in that bedroom for decades, so much so that the family's neighbors didn't know she existed. Yoshika returned to the books on the shelf after staring at her sister's closed bedroom door. She cleaned the house after dusting them. She dropped the duster, and Yoshika quietly tiptoed to Rina's closed bedroom door. She knocked softly. Rina hated loud noises, so Yoshika couldn't play the piano because it disturbed her. After Yoshika's light knock, she mentally counted to 30. Rina told her not to come in right away. If you knock and wait 30 seconds, I may let you in. Yoshika mentally counts 1, 2, 3. Then Rina tells Yoshika, "Okay, you can enter from inside the room." Slowly turning the knob, Yoshika opened her sister's bedroom door. It revealed this pitch-black room. Small, cramped space. Rina sat silently on her bed with all the shades and blinds drawn. So Yoshika kept her head down and avoided looking at Rina. She wanted to avoid upsetting her. Yoshika entered the room and picked up Rina's dirty dishes from the table. Yoshika turned and left again. As she did, she glanced at Rina's bedroom project. Rina had told her family she was doing this master's work, but wouldn't say more. To work on this masterwork, she needed a dark room, a quiet house, and complete focus. Family support was needed as she did this. Rina never defined this masterwork. She said it was special and combined all her life's elements. Spirit, body, soul. Even the family would build this masterpiece. Rina replied, "Oh, you'll know when the time is right," when her family asked how they could help her make this master work. Yoshika couldn't see the master work, so she turned her head back down and shuffled out of Rina's room, closing the door. Yoshika then went to the kitchen and dumped Rina's dishes in the sink, which was already clean because Rina's rule was to keep the house clean. Clean dishes, no dust. It had to be perfect. She could only work on this masterwork if she was always clean. Her brother, Takahiro, entered the kitchen as Yoshika cleaned and dried Rina's dishes and put them away. He would tell Yoshika they should leave the house and go to the market to buy Rina some supplies so she could keep working on this master work. Since everything was about Rina, Yoshika was furious that they had to do this. She hid her feelings and told her brother to let go. Takahiro viewed Rina differently than Yoshika. Yoshika hated Rina because now that she was home, she had to give up her career as a great pianist to help Rina with her master's work. However, Takahiro was happy to give up writing to support Rina. Because he believed in Rina and thought her master work would be the greatest art in human history, Takahiro was proud to participate. Takahiro and his family didn't know what this masterwork was. Takahiro and Rina got along better than Yoshika and Rina. Rina told Takahiro what she needed to build this masterwork. Rina told Takahiro what she needed that day, so he and Yoshika went to get it. Takahiro and Yoshika donned jackets and left. After getting out there, they both flipped their collars up, covered their faces, and leaned down. Because they avoided eye contact with others. This family was already private, but Rina told them to be even more private and not interact with others. They would hide when out in public. Yoshika and Takahiro went to the pharmacy. They sneaked in and bought surgical spirits, a medical alcohol. After buying that, the brother and sister put their collars back up and went outside to an old used bookstore to buy a palm reading book which uses hand lines to predict the future. When the brother and sister bought this book, they kept their heads down and didn't speak to the cashier. The brother and sister rushed home after getting their book. They arrived to find the door locked. Instead of opening their own door, the brother and sister knocked and waited. They heard 4 locks turning when their mother came to the door. Yoshika and Takahiro entered, closed the door, and locked the 4 deadbolts. Rina insisted that no family member carry a house key. It was too risky to lose the key in town and have someone enter their house and see Rina's work. They could not allow that. No one had keys. Each return home required knocking. Rina was worried about someone entering the house and seeing what she was doing, so they had 4 locks on the door. To Rina's closed bedroom door, Yoshika carried the bag with the surgical spirits and palm reading book. Yoshika placed the bag outside the door, turned around, and left without knocking. As she did, she heard Rina's door open slightly. Yoshika turned around and saw a tiny, skinny arm reach out from behind the door. The bag was grabbed and pulled back into the room, closing and locking the door. Helmsley was a quiet village where unusual events were noticed. Stone houses were older than trees, and the residents had lived in the valley for generations. Their quiet lives were nice. But the Yasutakes had always puzzled them. They were polite when they spoke, but they were so rare they could have been ghosts. They moved to the UK years ago and settled in this small cottage. The town initially liked them because their sister was a famous pianist and their brother was a writer. But the family had cloaked themselves in silence for years. They were like a fortress in a quiet English town. 3 days later, on the 18th of April 2018, Yoshika was reading in the kitchen when she heard her brother Takahiro talking to Rina. Takahiro and Rina were no longer talking face to face. Rina was in her bedroom with the door closed, and Takahiro was sitting on the ground with his back to the door talking to her. Unlike Yoshika and Rina, who had a bad relationship and rarely talked, Takahiro and Rina had a good relationship and did this often. They talked for hours through the door. Yoshika briefly ignored her brother and sister's chatter and returned to her book. However, she started hearing her brother's words, which was strange. After putting down her book, she started listening to Takahiro. His question was how to do that without making sense. How? Your soul alone. How? How? Yoshika sensed her brother's confusion and possible upset. She couldn't resist. She put her book down, and Yoshika walked out to the living room, looking down at her brother for a hint. He and Rina stopped talking when Takahiro saw Yoshika and shook his head, stood up, and left. After Takahiro left, Yoshika quietly walked over to Rina's bedroom door and pressed her ear against the wood to see if she could hear Rina and catch something she was saying to explain what she had heard. But all she heard was Rina slowly shuffling toward her bed in the back of her bedroom. Complete silence followed. Yoshika left the door and returned to the kitchen to read again. She could not focus on the book because a wave of sadness was washing over her. Yoshika felt this way because she was thinking about how close she and Rina were as kids. Very close for most of their lives. Even after Rina became reclusive, they remained friends. But something happened 5 years earlier in 2013 that ended their relationship forever. Rina came out of her bedroom that day, and Yoshika offered to read her palm. The sisters occasionally did this for each other. It helped them bond. Rina extended her hand, and Yoshika traced a long horizontal line on her palm. Rina had unusual hands. Simian lines on palms are rare. Rina had one. It resembles a hand-length horizontal line. Simian lines in palm reading can be good or bad. It may indicate a mystic or visionary. So that's good. It could mean they're aggressive or have a terrible disease. The downside, Rina thought her simian line was good. She claimed visionary soul. On this day in 2013, the family was banned from a local supermarket because Rina got upset with some staff members and screamed and yelled at them. So they were banned. Yoshika contemplates this and looks at Rina's palm, saying the simian line. You may have been aggressive at the supermarket because of this. Perhaps you're aggressive. However, Rina was so offended that she whipped her hand back and yelled at Yoshika, calling her an idiot and saying, "You don't understand my vision. I'll show the world this vision someday, and you and those grocery store idiots won't understand." Rina then punched and kicked Yoshika. Yoshika screams and defends herself. Takahiro, the brother, ran in to separate them. Rina was prone to angry outbursts, but this was her first physical attack. So Rina's mother worried she had a condition that caused her to lash out physically. Rina went to the doctor. The doctor would say, there's no physical cause. However, Rina appears to be having a mental breakdown and needs psychiatric treatment. Maybe even hospitalization. Rina rejected treatment and blamed Yoshika for everything. Rina stopped leaving her bedroom after that. She used to leave every couple of months, but now she stays 24/7. Rina added all these new rules for her family to follow so she could focus on her masterwork in her bedroom. Nobody had house keys and added those 4 locks to the door. The family was also instructed to learn Rina's new Japanese dialect. None would understand what they were saying. It would further shield them from outside evils. Rina also made sure her family got rid of their phones, TVs, and computers. Yoshika sat in the kitchen longer, thinking about how sad she was to lose contact with her sister. Yoshika regretted her simian line remarks. As usual, Yoshika pushed her feelings for Rina down and returned to reading her book. Yoshika saw her brother Takahiro sitting against Rina's bedroom door more often than usual, carrying on hushed conversations with Rina for several weeks. Yoshika noticed Takahiro cooking all Rina's meals. Takahiro seemed to have taken over cooking Rina's food from their mother. Yoshika collected Rina's dirty dishes because she was in charge of cleaning the house. As soon as Takahiro started cooking for Rina, Yoshika noticed more food on her plates. Rina was eating less than usual. This alarmed Yoshika. Rina was small already. Only 90 pounds, she was 4 foot 11 inches tall. Yoshika worried that she must eat. She is too small to skip meals. One day in mid-May, Yoshika entered Rina's bedroom and saw that all her dishes were full of the food she had been given. She hardly touched them. Yoshika actually never spoke to Rina in the bedroom. But she couldn't resist this time. Without looking at Rina Yoshika, she gathered up the plates of food and told her to eat more. Rina remained silent. Yoshika turned and left the room quickly. After that, Takahiro told Yoshika, "Rina doesn't want you in her room again. Rina will now put your dishes outside the door. Thus, you avoid entering that room." Around the same time, Rina, who usually only left her bedroom to use the bathroom, started doing so at night when her family was asleep to avoid them. Rina had almost no family interactions by this point. Rina sent Takahiro and Yoshika to the store more and more in early August to buy surgical spirits and medical alcohol. Takahiro and Yoshika didn't know what Rina was doing with these surgical spirits, but they bought them to support her. They would return home with these bottles, and Takahiro would barely open Rina's door to tuck the bottle in before Rina took it. Rina would never give them her empty bottle after the door closed. The bottle went in and stayed. Takahiro and Rina appeared to fight on the 18th of August, 2018. Yoshika was in the kitchen when she saw Takahiro sitting against Rina's bedroom door having a quiet conversation. Takahiro stood up, turned around, and yelled into the door. I said, "Your soul was insufficient." After Rina replied, Takahiro said, "No, please." He seemed to be pleading with Rina to reconsider. Takahiro opened Rina's bedroom door and walked inside before Yoshika could ask him what was wrong, and the house went silent. The room was too scary for Yoshika to enter. She stayed in the kitchen and listened. It was quiet for 15 minutes. Takahiro left Rina's bedroom and closed the door, looking calm. Yoshika looked over and asked what was going on. Takahiro would smile and tell Yoshika, "Rina's masterwork is almost done." Takahiro then asked Yoshika if she remembered Rina saying her master's work would require family help. However, she said, "We will know when to participate." Yoshika replied, "I remember." "Now is the time," Takahiro said. Takahiro told Yoshika to get more surgical spirits at the store. Yoshika followed him without question. They bought 3 times as much surgical spirits at the store. After they got home, Takahiro alone went into Rina's bedroom with surgical spirits. He closed the door, and Yoshika sat in the kitchen for 10 minutes until Takahiro returned without the surgical spirits. He would approach Yoshika and say Rina is ready to reconcile. Sitting by the door and talking to her will let you help her create her masterwork. This news frustrated and relieved Yoshika. She never thought it fair that Rina had completely cut her off after her 2013 palm reading simian line joke. Rina also made Yoshika's life difficult for years. Yoshika had to give up her piano dreams, friends, and life goals to support Rina. Despite that, Yoshika missed Rina deeply. They used to be close. She wanted that relationship back. First, Yoshika sat against Rina's closed bedroom door and didn't say anything. Rina also said nothing. But then the floodgates opened and Yoshika began crying about how her and Rinas's relationship had gone south and how she wanted to fix it. Now, when Yoshika would talk through the door to Rina, like when she was trying to open it to drop something off, Rina would usually start banging on something inside the room to tell her to stop and leave. Yoshika spent her time pouring her heart out to Rina through the door, but she noticed no pounding from inside. She was heard by Rina. Next day, Yoshika and Takahiro went to the store again and bought more surgical spirits to bring back to the house. This time, Yoshika was allowed to enter Rina's bedroom. Rina was on the bed when Takahiro and Yoshika entered the dark bedroom. Takahiro showed Yoshika what to do as they approached her. The final step of Rina's master's project. They had to rub Rina's body with surgical spirits. Yoshika didn't understand why they were doing this, but she respected Rina's plan and was happy to be part of creating this master work, so she didn't ask any questions. After rubbing alcohol on Rina for about 10 minutes, the brother and sister left, closed the door, and Yoshika sat down against the door and poured her heart out to Rina again. It was very therapeutic. In many ways, Yoshika was happy again. She was finally fixing her relationship with Rina. Yoshika's daily routine changed over several weeks. After getting all these surgical spirits, she and her brother would rub them on Rina, and then Yoshika would chat with her through the door all day. All done. After Yoshika and Takahiro applied these surgical spirits to Rina's body on the 25th of September 2018, Yoshika told Rina she had a special surprise for her. Yoshika was in a good mood today because she was feeling good about her new relationship with her sister and because she and her brother usually didn't talk to the pharmacist who sold the surgical spirits because they tried to hide and make it clear they weren't talking. On this day, the pharmacist was talking to Yoshika. Yoshika decided to respond. Their conversation lacked substance. Finally, the pharmacist asked Yoshika why she was buying surgical spirits. Yoshika would say, "They are for my sister Rina, who needs more and more of them every day. She is working on something special, but we don't know what it is, but this is part of it, and we know it will be worth it." For Yoshika, who had little social contact, this conversation was great, even though it seemed pointless. She felt ready to do something special for Rina when she got home. After Yoshika and Takahiro left Rina's bedroom with surgical spirits, Yoshika surprised Rina. Yoshika went to the family piano near Rina's bedroom. Yoshika was nervous, but she sat on the bench, opened the lid, and touched the keys. Yoshika was surprised to learn that she would play the Waltz of the Flowers, a classical piece inspired by the composer's love for his sister. Yoshika thought this was the perfect song to perform in this house for Rina. She will know I adore her. Yoshika played the song, listening for Rina to bang something to stop her. Yet again, she did not. It was quiet. Yoshika played this lovely song. When it happened again, Yoshika waited for Rina to yell or be mad about playing loud music in the house. It was quiet, though. Yoshika felt close to her sister again, and she soon started crying with joy. But Yoshika heard a bang when she closed the piano lid. It wasn't from Rina's bedroom. Coming from the front door. Yoshika heard a scream outside the front door moments later. Police speak. Before Yoshika could open the door, her mother ran there. She opened all 4 locks, but only opened one crack and yelled at the police to leave. Police were pushing on the door to get the mother out of the way. Yoshika moved over and looked through the crack and saw more than 2 police officers. It was an army of police, firefighters, and EMTs. There was an ambulance. Soon, the police officer yelling, "Open up," pushed and opened the door completely. A uniformed horde flooded the home. As soon as the officers entered the house, they opened every door as if looking for something. Finally, they opened Rina's bedroom door. Once they did, Yoshika watched the officers stop at the doorway. They cursed, yelled, and looked away. Officers then entered Rina's bedroom. 1 minute later, they started talking on the radio. Emergency medical personnel entered the house with a stretcher. After entering Rina's bedroom, Yoshika, Takahiro, and their mother watched the stretcher return with officers and technicians. Rina was stretchered, and she looked awful. Her eyes were rolled back in her head, and her skin was translucent. She looked like a skeleton. The events in that family's home became international news. And not because Rina was secretly painting a masterpiece in her bedroom. The facts are here. Rina stopped eating in April 2018. She said she only needed her visionary soul nourished. Because of her visionary soul, she didn't need food. Yoshika overheard Takahiro telling Rina, "Only your soul how?" He was trying to figure out how Rina's soul would sustain her. It made no sense. 4 months later, on August 18, Yoshika heard her brother and sister talking through the bedroom door again. Except today, Takahiro stood up and yelled through the door, "I told you your soul was not enough," sounding like he was fighting with Rina. He then broke into Rina's bedroom and stayed there in silence for 15 minutes before calmly telling Yoshika that Rina is almost done with her master's work and we just need to get her more surgical spirits. Takahiro actually yelled at Rina through the door because she wasn't responding to his attempts to talk to her. His suspicion was that she wasn't eating. He shouted at her and barged into a room to find Rina unresponsive. No movement, no speech. He stood there, unsure what to do. As Takahiro stands there, he realizes the time. Get involved now. Takahiro left the bedroom with Yoshika and went to the pharmacy to get more surgical spirits. When they returned, Takahiro alone covered Rina's bedroom in these spirits. Because she had asked him to do that before, and he thought she needed more spirits now that she couldn't talk or move. Her visionary soul will nourish her while she finishes this master work. For the next month, Takahiro and Yoshika applied these spirits to Rina's body, believing they were helping her finish her masterwork. On September 25, while Yoshika and Takahiro were buying more spirits at the pharmacy, the pharmacist finally spoke to Yoshika because he had noticed that these surgical spirits smelled bad every time they came in. It smelled terrible when they arrived this day. The pharmacist finally asked Yoshika what these surgical spirits were for. Yoshika gave this weird answer about how the spirits were for her sister and she was working on her masterwork in her bedroom and it would be worth it. After Yoshika and Takahiro left that day, the pharmacist was so alarmed that he called the police. The police found Rina not building a masterwork in her bedroom when they arrived at the family home. She had been dead in bed for 6 weeks. Rina died around August 18 when Takahiro entered and found her unresponsive. So Yoshika and Rina never reconciled. Why Takahiro told Yoshika that Rina was ready to reconcile with him is unknown. Rina was dead at the time and would not have said anything. Yoshika had fake heart-to-hearts with her sister through the door and played her fake music. From August 18th until September, when the police broke into their home, Yoshika and Takahiro spent nearly every day rubbing this strange medical alcohol on their dead sister's body because they believed she wanted it. Alcohol was actually mummifying her body. The conditions inside that room must have been unimaginable to outsiders in the weeks before the police discovery. Yasutake families saw it as their reality. Because of their prolonged isolation, their minds had adapted to a different set of rules. They didn't see a medical emergency when Rina stopped talking. A spiritual shift occurred. They did not see death when she froze. They saw her genius in action. The bulk surgical spirits they bought were chemical preservatives. The body decomposes naturally after death. But Takahiro and Yoshika were constantly applying this highly concentrated alcohol to her skin, drying out the tissues before the bacteria could break them down. They were unknowingly performing an ancient preservation ritual. They kept her skin, hair, and body from breaking down. This showed them the master work was working. They felt validated every day when they entered that dark room and saw that her body was not changing normally. They believed these surgical spirits connected her soul to the physical world. Emergency personnel entered that bedroom to a strong surgical spirit smell that stung their eyes. But behind that chemical smell was the smell of a human body kept in a dark room for over a month. Bedroom walls were covered in Renus's art. Strange, complex paintings that moved in the dim light. The floor was covered in philosophy, language, and art books. Rena's bed was in the center. Her body was properly cared for, and she wore her usual clothes. She had brushed her hair and cleaned her face. She was absolutely skeletal. Her skin had tightened over her bones, making her a mummy. Police officers entering that room were unprepared for what they saw. They anticipated a sibling dispute or neglect. They were surprised to find 3 people living with a preserved corpse as if it were alive. The discovery shocked the entire department immediately. To document the scene, forensic investigators had to wear protective gear due to the biological and chemical fumes in the cottage. The town of Helmsley was stunned. They had lived with this quiet family for years. They had seen the brother and sister walking to the shops with collars up and heads down. They knew they were private, but never imagined something so bizarre and tragic was happening behind those locked doors. Local news covered the story, and national and international journalists visited the quiet village. Satellite trucks and reporters flooded the stone cottages and narrow streets, trying to figure out how this could have happened in such a peaceful place. Renus's death investigation was complicated. The first step for forensic pathologists was to determine her death date and manner. However, her body was preserved by surgical spirits, making an autopsy difficult. Normal toxicological tests were difficult due to her tissue chemical changes. After weeks of careful examination, medical examiners found no physical violence or trauma on her body. Strangulation, defensive wounds, and poison were absent. Only that her body had run out of energy made sense. She starved herself to death for spiritual mastery. Attorneys had to decide what to charge the family. The UK has a charge for this. Preventing a proper burial. A lengthy prison sentence is possible for this serious crime. Yoshika Takahiro and their 80-year-old mother were arrested and charged with this crime. However, as the legal process progressed, everyone involved realized this was no ordinary criminal case. The family did not act like body hiders. They were honest in interviews. They were completely honest about their actions. They detailed how they cared for Rina, rubbed surgical spirits on her body, and waited for her to finish her master's work to the police. She wasn't mentioned in the past. They felt Rina's presence. The court ordered extensive psychological evaluations for Yoshika Takahiro and their mother. These psychiatrists interviewed one of their most unusual cases. They found no malice in the family. They did not hurt Rina or hide her death for financial gain. They did it out of love and devotion. But their love was filtered through shared delusions. Psychologists diagnosed the family with folie à trois, a rare form of shared delusional disorder. This psychological condition involves transferring delusions from one person to close friends. In this household, Rina was dominant. Her genius, artistic talent, and charisma allowed her to control her siblings and mother. When Rina developed delusions about her soul supporting her body, her family didn't question her. They trusted her completely. Being so isolated from society meant no one to check their reality. No one to tell them their beliefs were impossible. Rina retreated deeper into her room over time, and the family protected her. No one questioned her rules. Communication devices were removed. Her invented language was taught. Lived in complete silence. They formed a belief loop. That loop continued after Rina died. Instead, it adapted. Takahiro could not believe his sister, the genius who would create the greatest art in history, was dead. His mind came up with an explanation for her survival: simply moving on with her master's work. Since Yoshika and their mother were in the same closed loop, they accepted his explanation immediately. The court hearings were solemn. The family appeared fragile and out of touch with courtroom reality. They didn't understand why they were charged. They only followed Rena's instructions. They looked after her. They shielded her. They saw legal proceedings as another outside obstacle they had spent decades avoiding. The defense claimed that trying this family would be a miscarriage of justice. They claimed that the family members were not criminally liable because their mental illness prevented them from understanding Renus's death. After reviewing psychiatric reports, the prosecution agreed. They realized imprisoning this family was pointless. They had no criminal intent or public danger. So the judge dropped all charges against Yoshika Takahiro and their mother. The court found them mentally unfit to stand trial. They were placed with local mental health services instead of jail. I tried to gently bring them back to reality so they could accept Rena's death and grieve her properly. After years, it's unclear if mental health professionals succeeded. Family returned to Helmsley's small stone cottage. 4 locks remain on the door. Light-blocking shades remain. Their neighbors rarely see them. Sometimes they see Takahiro or Yoshika walking to the store to buy groceries with their heads down and collars up, as usual. They no longer buy surgical spirits in bulk because police and medical authorities monitor them. However, they remain quiet and isolated. Many in the village believe the family has never accepted Renus's death. They believe the family speaks Rena's invented language in that quiet, clean cottage. They maintain absolute silence at home. The empty bedroom makes them think Rena is gone, or that her spirit is still working on the master work that will be revealed. The Yasutaka's tragedy is isolation. It shows how easily the mind can lose touch with reality when isolated. It shows how love and devotion can turn disturbing and bizarre in the dark. Yoshika Yasutake once filled concert halls with her music. Brother Takahiro could create worlds with words. Sister Rena was a genius with the world at her feet. They were all consumed by the darkness of a single room in a quiet English village. The Helmsley cottage silently commemorates this strange case. People who pass it on their way to the shops or castle ruins often wonder what's inside the windows. They wonder if this silence Rena demanded will last forever, or if the music will return. Death cannot break the family's bond, a shared faith that defied nature and society. The story ends with a quiet return to normal, not a dramatic confession or trial. A family hiding a secret only they know. They wait forever in their silent fortress for a master work that has reached its tragic end. Many thanks for watching. Comment your thoughts on today's episode. And remember, you can binge on our true crime playlist right now. Till next time. See you.